Hey people, Shinobi no Kami here. In this fanfic, due to a tragic event, Naruto awakens the Rinnegan and becomes a monk. How will this affect the timeline? Will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of this new power leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy it. Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. So without any further ado, let's roll the intro. Chapter 20, Lightning Part 1. A person that learns from their mistakes is smart. A person that learns from other people's mistakes is smarter. Proverb. You're lost again, aren't you? Even with the heavy mist surrounding the group, it was clear Fu was the one speaking, her deadpan tone cutting through the fog like an overly sarcastic knife. I'm not lost. And don't say again like it's happened before, we were not lost. I just happened to be reading the map wrong. Naruto shot Fu an annoyed look before returning his attention to the path in front of him. If he took his attention away, it was quite likely they would stray off the road. By wrong, do you mean upside down? This time it was Shizuku at the receiving end of Naruto's agitated glare, not that anybody could tell when seeing even a few feet in front of them was impossible. It was an honest mistake. I've never been to Kaminari no Kuni before. Shizuku just snickered into her baggy sleeves, making Naruto wonder how she was dealing with the cold with such thin clothing. Yeah, and if this keeps up, I'll start to think we still aren't. This time Naruto found he didn't have the energy for a scathing retort. He just settled for pranking Fu at a later date. He sighed wearily into his scarf, tilting his Sugagasa back to peer up at the sky. It was useless though, the heavy water vapor in the air made it impossible to even see where the sun was. Come on, Konoha is just in a forest. It even has roads leading to it. Why do all the other hidden villages have to take their names so seriously? Suna is in the middle of the desert. Taki is nearly impossible to find unless you're lead there, and Kumo is hidden so high in the mountains you either get lost in the mountains or pass out from the thin air. After a few seconds of silence he realized he was ranting to deaf ears and slumped forward dejectedly. Briefly he wondered what had happened to his wise monk persona. Don't worry Naruto, the merchants have to get there somehow. We'll find Kumogakure eventually. Naruto smiled appreciatively at Shizuku as she rested her hand on his shoulder, or at least he thought it was her. Actually, Kumogakure is a mostly militant hidden village. All merchant and domestic requirements are met in other villages further down in the mountains. The village itself is purely for housing the shinobi, their families, the equipment stores, and the rakeage tower. Food and produce is moved to the shinobi populace in large supply runs coordinated weekly. So in a way it's more of a large base camp than a village in the ways we define the term. Once again Naruto sunk down, Fu's almost encyclopedic knowledge of all things shinobi once again proving to be spot on. Great. Shizuku frowned at Fu, or at least where she thought Fu was. The cloud bank they were trying to navigate through was really quite thick. On a positive note, it wasn't raining. Probably because they were actually in the clouds as opposed to under them, still a plus for Shizuku though. Can't you find chakra sources in the fog with your eyes? Naruto straightened up as they continued on, suddenly looking like he hadn't just broken down slightly. No, there's something about the cloud here that just bounces around the chakra. Everything just looks like a vague blue haze. Shizuku looked down while Fu looked thoughtful. It wasn't very different to her normal look, but her lips pursed slightly. What about summoning something to fly us over the clouds? Naruto turned to the former Taki Kunoichi, hand raised and mouth open, only for him to falter and just stare at the girl for a moment. That is actually an excellent idea. He just blinked to himself for a moment as he wondered why he hadn't thought of that sooner. He'd put it down to not being familiar enough with his new path before molding his chakra and slamming his hand down. Kuchios. For a moment they weren't blinded by the mist as the small explosion of smoke pushed it away, giving the trio a brief glimpse of what Naruto had summoned. What the heck is that? The other two shared Shizuku's sentiments as they stared at the strange creature. For the most part it looked like a bird with gray feathers, except about 10 times as big as an average hawk. However, its beak was horribly distended, looking more like a drill than a mouth. I have no idea, I just thought for something that would be able to carry us. I didn't really think of any specifics. He moved to the side, noting that the creature at least had the Rinnegan eyes, which mean it didn't exist naturally, thankfully. Well, it'll do for now, come on. With that, Naruto jumped up onto the bird's back, staring strangely for a moment at the black spike seemingly impaled in the creature's neck. That's weird, it looks like a chakra rod is implanted here, but I've never summoned this thing before. Fu hopped up next, taking a moment to look at the spike before grabbing a hold of it so she wouldn't fall off. Well, it makes a good handhold. Shizuku jumped on last, looking wearily at the bird thing's head. She could have sworn its eyes were looking at her. Naruto wasn't quite sure how to get the bird to move, but as soon as he thought that its large wings began to beat up and down rhythmically, quickly lifting the improbably large beast up into the air. He noticed that with each flap of its enormous wings some mist would be cleared away, revealing more of the road, and he wasn't the only one. Hey, why didn't you use your wind manipulation to just clear the cloud away? Naruto just shot Shizuku an unamused glance as he held onto the bird tightly. It's a little late for the suggestions. Anyway, with the amount of chakra that it would take to do such a thing, we would have Kumo Shinobi on us in minutes. We want to try and keep a low profile this time around. Shizuku just snorted quietly into her sleeve. Nothing they did was ever low profile. At least then they would be able to lead us into Kumo. Fu quickly shook her head as they slowly rose higher into the air, making Naruto wonder just how thick the cloud bank was. Incorrect. Kumo's first initiative when confronted by possible hostiles using chakra close to the village's border is immediate detainment followed by questioning. Shizuku just looked thoughtful as she gripped onto one of the bird's massive feathers, fighting the suction the wings made as they pumped down. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. Fu just stared at the girl for a moment before Shizuku lowered her head sheepishly. You didn't really mean questioning, did you? It wasn't really a question, but Fu shook her head anyway. I think we're almost there. As if Naruto's words were prophetic, at that moment the group burst from the surrounding clouds, wincing as the bright sunlight hit their eyes. For a moment they all just sat there as silence, looking around in total awe at the world around them. White fluffy clouds stretched out as far as they could see like an ocean of wool, only sparsely penetrated by towering mountain tops that broke through like they were climbing towards the sun. Whoa. That summed up the collective thoughts of the group fairly accurately, their odd expressions making them look like children seeing the sea for the first time. Naruto was the first to recover as he began to peer at a nearby cluster of mountain tops, seemingly the tallest out of the range. He spotted it, the shine of glass and metal wrapped around one of the peaks, a grin spread across his whiskered cheeks. Hey, what do you know? We weren't that far off. He was about right, the village was probably only a few miles away, minutes if they made the journey on the bird. Of course, them landing in the middle of a village on what was quite clearly a summon, if not a strange one, would be incredibly suspicious. From Fu's description, Naruto didn't picture Kumo as the type of place to be all that welcoming to such an arrival. We'll land over there. He pointed out a small rocky outcropping that just about poked through the clouds, only a short distance from the village itself. It was close enough that they wouldn't get lost and far enough that most sensors wouldn't immediately pick them up. A few minutes later they were dismounting the large and odd bird, which was quickly dispelled in a burst of smoke. Shizuku shivered slightly. She could have sworn the creepy avian shot her another look just before it vanished. The only sound echoing in the now slightly thinning mist was the jangle of Naruto's shakuju and the click it made on the rocky ground as the group walked. By now they should have been within a few hundred meters of the village, unless of course they managed to get lost again. Thankfully at that moment a small group of Kumo shinobi, as their headbands indicated, dropped down in front of them, led by a young man with spiked-out blonde hair. Stop. Come any closer and we will have to arrest you under suspicion of infiltrating Kumogakur. Naruto smiled pleasantly at the man as he moved his staff away from his body in a disarming manner. It's all right, we're just travelers looking to enter the village to resupply and see the sights. The young man stared at the other blonde for a moment with piercing black eyes before nodding with a shrug. All right, you're telling the truth. If you'd lied your chakra would have been disturbed. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that, then again was to be suspected the first people to meet possible intruders would be censor types. We'll escort you to the village entrance, but be warned, after that you will be under close surveillance. Anything we find suspicious and Akumo shinobi will not hesitate to apprehend you and your companions. Naruto nodded amicably as he motioned for the older blonde to lead on. Understood. He looked up at the man expectantly who only returned it with slight irritation. Now please follow me quickly, we have to get back to our patrol. He motioned for the two men flanking him to continue on their route while he took a different path, setting off at a brisk walk. So what's Kumo like? The blonde man looked round at the girl dressed as a shrine maiden with a raised brow before smirking. It's the most powerful village in the elemental nations, there isn't a better place to be from. Naruto gained a smirk of his own, because that very objective opinion wasn't biased at all. The rest of the admittedly short journey was made in silence before the group finally emerged from the oppressive cloud bank, only to gawk for the second time that day. Kumo was beautiful. Despite being a treacherous and mountainous region, the people had adapted perfectly. Buildings were built in and out of the mountain tops themselves, offering unparalleled protection by giving an almost perfect view of the surroundings. Long sturdy bridges stretched between the various peaks, swaying slightly in the high-altitude breeze. The light glittered off of the surrounding clouds, giving everything an almost ethereal look despite all the combat-ready shinobi darting about with sure feet. In the middle of it all, wrapped around the highest mountain in the range, was an astounding feat of engineering. A large ring of metal and blue glass secured around the entire peak with the kanji for lightning proudly displayed at the front, clearly marking it as the Raikage Tower. It sat like a jewel in Kumo's rocky crown, standing vigil over the entire village. Naruto blinked as he noticed a few of the windows on the top floor looked broken, like somebody had thrown something through them. She just looked at their odd faces with a small smirk before proudly looking at his village. Impressive sight, isn't it? He chuckled lightly as he turned to leave. The trio were in the hands of Kumo's Anbu now, watching from the shadows. It has to be when we're competing with things like the Hokage Monument and Iwa's volcanoes. With that he gave them a farewell wave before dashing off to meet back up with his squad. Well, okay, where to first, guys? Naruto looked at his two companions expectantly, keeping an eye on the well-concealed chakra signature hiding in the shadows of a nearby craggy outcropping. Food. Fu and Shizuku looked at one another with smiles as Naruto laughed at their momentary synchronization. Okay, food it is. Okay, I'm off to find someplace I can earn some money. Fu waved distractedly at the blonde, currently reading one of the scrolls he had brought along with rapt attention. Shizuku walked over. She had also been reading, but it was less relevant to her. Without the more advanced water manipulation techniques, she was stuck on the more basic level. She was trying to be creative with her little water pillar, but ultimately she couldn't advance until they had more information. Naruto wasn't so sure he could conveniently earn the trust of an academy student to get him the information this time. Good luck, just try not to run into the village's Jinchuriki right away. Shizuku gave him a knowing smile while Fu even looked up, a small smirk playing across her lips. Naruto just looked amused as he stepped out the door of the temple backwards, an eyebrow raised. Come on, I'm not that bad. So what if I accidentally ran into two Jinchuriki in their respective village? It's not like it's going to happen everywhere. Shizuku just giggled into her sleeve before waving the young blonde off, returning to her scroll. They had been in Kumo for a few days now under the hospitality of an elderly priest who was already half-blind from age. Naruto was fairly certain the old man was only allowing them to stay because he seemed to have mistaken the blonde for somebody else, despite his insistence he was not, Todoroi. He stepped out of the building, putting a hand up to block the sun from his eyes for a moment. Up in the mountains, without reliable cloud coverage, the sun seemed a lot brighter than normal. He supposed that was the only reason the mountain top was not bitingly cold. Strong breezes and even storms were apparently quite common in Kumo. It was why every other building had a large lightning rod on the roof, both to redirect nature's anger and harness it into power. He was currently walking towards Kumo's small shopping district. He had already been through once before on a small tour the trio took to get acquainted with the village. There weren't all that many shops, but they were all high quality and most were for shinobi outfitting. He figured he could earn some money in the evenings either cleaning or tidying up one of the stores. Unfortunately, he seemed to have lost his way in one of the more winding alleys. He had no map to consult, so he relented and walked over to the nearest person to ask direction. "Hey, could you tell me how to get to the merchant district?" The woman he had talked to looked around with just a hint of annoyance. From her rigid posture and unusual outfit he could guess she was a shinobi. The headband helped as well, and by her crossed arms and lightly tapping foot it was clear she was waiting for something or someone. She raised a blonde eyebrow at the small monk who had walked up to her. "Huh, you're actually talking to me. You must not be from Kumo." Naruto blinked at the odd reply before returning his face to his normal serene mask. "Is there any reason I shouldn't talk to you?" He said it almost jokingly, which brought a smirk to the taller woman's face as she leaned in closer to him, an almost predatory look in her dark chocolate eyes. "Oh, there are several." She leaned in even closer, her voice becoming more of a sultry whisper. "But you shouldn't worry about those." She leaned back again, a satisfied look on her smirking features at Naruto's shocked and slightly dazed form. "Hey, you're too easy, Gaki. Gotta be more careful or some girl's gonna wind you around their little finger." She grinned again, looking very much like a cat playing with the mouse she had caught. "That is if I don't beat them to it." She finished by running her tongue across her lips, revealing slightly pointed canines behind shining red lips. Right, the market." The woman just laughed, a soft tinkling sound that had Naruto shaking his head out of the daze that came over him. He looked the woman over. She had sandy blonde hair pulled into a long ponytail, wrapped most of the way down with bandages with a small tuft at the end like a lion's tail. She ran a hand down her side, smoothing the tight purple and black top she was wearing, to rest on her hip, covered by a simple maroon sash. Strangely, she seemed to have prayer beads wound around one of her bandage-wrapped arms, ending at her fingerless purple gloves. "That way, honey." She pointed off in a certain direction as Naruto gave a small and hesitant nod of appreciation, earning another tinkling laugh from the strange kunoichi. Thanks." The woman just gave a sly grin as her posture shifted, her hips moving to the side in an overly seductive manner. "Oh, wanting my name so soon? We only just met, isn't it polite to give yours first?" Naruto had to shake himself out of his daze again before nodding more assuredly. "Right, it's Naruto Uzumaki." The woman merely smirked as she leaned back against the building she had been waiting at. "Yugito, or you can call me Nisama." Her smile once again took on a predatory edge. "Either's fine." Naruto just nodded as he took slow careful steps backwards, widening the woman's grin. "Well then, thanks Yugito-san." The older blonde pouted mockingly at that, but Naruto missed it. He had already turned and walked on. Yugito merely sighed pleasantly as she crossed her arms again, pressing up her chest more noticeably. Kids are so much fun. A few days later, Naruto was sitting cross-legged in a rocky clearing halfway down a mountainside. Really, it was a training ground, but it just looked like a random plateau carved from the mountain. There was a single bare tree hanging precariously at an angle over the edge to a very long and steep drop below. Naruto liked it. It was very peaceful and it was just above the clouds to the point where a light mist drifted along the bottom few inches of the stony floor. If he looked out over the edge, all he could see was an ocean of white with the occasional gray. It was nice to be somewhere it wasn't raining, that didn't force him to circulate fire chakra just to stay warm. He flinched in pain as a stray arc of electricity left a slight burn on his hands. Currently, no pun intended, he was working on his lightning manipulation and it was proving to be a rather painful experience. The technique involved passing a small current between his slightly separated fingers, enough to be visible as a blue arc. Then as his control progressively got better, he would separate the fingers more and more. The end goal was to pass the current between his hands in one continuous loop through his circled arms. However, lightning proved to be a rather unpredictable element to control. Right now he could still only keep his forefinger and thumb about 2 inches apart. Any more than that and he would lose control, the electricity arcing out to leave him with a small but still irritating burn. It actually worked as a rather effective, if not unappreciated incentive, not that it helped the blonde's mood much, as yet another small red welt appeared on his hand with an accompanying cry of irritation and pain. "Hey, who are you?" Naruto looked up, spotting a young dark-skinned shinobi with short white hair wearing the traditional Kumo uniform of the white one-shoulder flak jacket over a dark gray hoodie. Oddly enough, he had a sucker sticking out of his mouth, complementing his overall bored demeanor well. He had a sword slung over his back, although from the way he moved it was painfully obvious he hadn't had much experience with it yet. He kept readjusting it every couple of moments. "Oh hello, I'm a monk from Hai no Kuni. I'm actually practicing lightning manipulation, so I thought what better place than Kaminari no Kuni." He said it jokingly but was rather taken aback by how serious the boy suddenly became. As his feet touched down on the plateau he sank into a crouched position, looking down at the floor. Monks learning jutsu. But what if all the monks become more powerful than us shinobi and decide to conquer us because we sometimes kill for money? Then I accidentally seduce one of the monk's daughters and she has to choose between her loyalty to her temple or her love with me. We run off together but are hunted down by both monks and shinobi only to fight back, killing the leader of both sides, causing instability in their ranks and causing the collapse of society as we know it. He looked up, actually looking a little afraid by what he said while Naruto just blinked at him. "Well, that's certainly a concern." The shinobi just nodded, his eyes widened. He was obviously still thinking about this strange alternate world of his. Naruto just shook his head and returned to what he was doing, only to cry out in pain as he was once again simultaneously shocked and burned a little. The dark-skinned boy looked up, apparently shaken out of his prophetic vision of a horrendous future as he glanced at what the blonde was doing. "Oh, I remember having to do that. B-sensei never gave us any help." "Well actually, he might have, but because of the way he talks it's hard to tell sometimes." He walked over, crouching beside Naruto and watching the electricity arc between his stretched fingers. He moved his sucker from one side of his mouth to the other as he hummed for a moment. "Yeah, I got stuck around here too. It was Samui Taiko who figured it out first, she always does." He looked off into the distance and for a moment Naruto feared he was about to go off on another rant. "What you're doing is trying to control the lightning, except electricity doesn't like to be controlled. It lashes out. Instead you simply have to imagine your fingers as points for the current to travel between, one the emitter and the other the lightning rod. This way you don't try and control the electricity, you simply guide it along a certain path. It's kind of like tricking it." Naruto looked up, rather impressed at the surprisingly helpful advice. He looked down at his hand, circulating the lightning chakra again as he slowly moved his fingers apart. He was shocked, again no pun intended, when he was able to move them all the way apart while still keeping a steady stream of arcing electricity going. He grinned, looking up at the cloud shinobi with a thankful nod to which the boy just moved his sucker again. "Thanks, but why are you helping me so readily?" The boy just shrugged lazily before frowning as he was once again forced to readjust the sword on his back. "It's no problem, I just remember how frustrating it was when I was doing it. I'm Omoi by the way." The white-haired shinobi held out a hand which Naruto gladly accepted, shaking once. "Naruto." Omoi stood up, shifting the sword again with a roll of his shoulders. "Anyway, you should wait until you see the second stage of lighting manipulation." The boy grinned in an uncharacteristically sadistic manner as if he knew something Naruto didn't. "Omoi." Suddenly a third voice cut in through the otherwise quiet mountainside, causing a look of alarm to appear in Omoi's widened eyes. Nice meeting you Naruto, I have to go now." With that he gave a quick incline of the head and practically leapt from the plateau like a base jumper. Seconds later a very angry-looking kunoichi slid down from the same place Omoi had come from. She had spiky red hair that covered her back, held back by a bandana she had fixed her forehead protector to. Other than that she wore the standard Kumo attire just like Omoi except over a ragged, sleeveless gray vest and a long skirt. Most remarkable were her striking golden eyes which matched her small ball-bearing earrings. "Hey you, blondie, you see a white-haired dopey-looking guy come through here. Might have exaggerated some random story to ridiculous lengths." Naruto just nodded quickly, pointing off in a random direction. He didn't know what Omoi did to aggravate this kunoichi, but it was the least he could do for the pointer he gave him. The girl just smirked viciously before sprinting off in the completely wrong direction. She too carried a sword, but he couldn't tell if she was any more competent with it than Omoi. After she had gone Naruto just shook his head slowly before chuckling to himself. It was almost as if he attracted the craziest elements of any village he entered. He just shrugged it off as one of those things as he returned to his exercise. Slowly though he began to drift off before completely losing himself to his inner consciousness. After getting the traditional welcome out of the way within his seal, Naruto once again distracted Shukaku by throwing a chakra rod. He found so far that his conversations with the Kyuubi went a lot smoother without the giant tanuki around. It wasn't like the sand construct was good for any meaningful conversation anyway beyond his insane mutterings and excited cries of, "Father." He sat down at the center of the room, calmly mediating as the rhythmic breeze of the Kyuubi's breath caused his robes to flutter as they played their game of, "Who's going to talk first? What are you wearing on your head?" The blonde opened an eye slightly in amusement. He didn't even have to try today and the great fox already seemed highly agitated by something. His tone was dark and almost came out as a growl, further enhanced by his lips being pulled back into snarl. "It's a forehead protector." The Kyuubi just snorted in its typical manner, its eyes remaining narrowed as it glared at its jailer. "I know what it is, Rinnegan." Naruto chuckled as he opened his eyes, dropping the pretense of meditation as he lounged back on his hands. "Then why ask?" The enormous red eyes only narrowed further. It seemed the Kyuubi wasn't in the mood for their usual back and forth today. "Why are you wearing it?" Naruto just raised a curious eyebrow, wondering why the Kyuubi was so interested in what he was wearing all of a sudden. "It was a gift, and I think it looks good." Another warm gust of air swept over him with the fox's grunt of disapproval. "You look even more ridiculous and pitiful than usual, Rinnegan." Naruto just grinned. He wondered if it was at all sane to be completely unconcerned with the words of a being that could crush you with a mere absent flick of one of its tails. Okay, it wouldn't be that simple, but the Kyuubi was definitely more powerful than he was, vastly so. "When did you become a fashion critic?" All he received was another indignant snort, somewhat of a staple response for the great fox. They lapsed into another uncomfortable silence with only the surprisingly gentle sounds of the Kyuubi breathing providing the background noise. "What is it you truly hope to accomplish by coming in here, Rinnegan?" Naruto looked up in moderate surprise. The Kyuubi's features were still twisted into a slight snarl, but the venom in its voice was all but gone. Instead, the great fox just seemed tired. It had slunk down to rest its head on its paws, one eye closed while the other stared at Naruto with a mix between curiosity and loathing. "I've already told you, I want to understand you. To understand why you bear so much hatred." For once the Kyuubi didn't snort, it didn't grunt, it didn't rebuke Naruto in any way. "Why?" Again Naruto couldn't help but blink in surprise. This was the closest he had ever come to holding a normal conversation with the Biju. "Because you deserve the chance to be heard like everybody else." The great beast snorted loudly, although this time it was not out of spite or indignation. If anything, the Kyuubi sounded somewhat amused, if such a thing were possible for a being of pure chakra. "I have wiped out entire human settlements over the centuries, killed thousands if not millions of your kind. To your people I am known as a harbinger of destruction and death, more akin to a natural disaster than an actual intelligent being. Why would you show me the same courtesy that you would your own kind when you can barely even comprehend what I am?" Naruto looked down for a moment, feeling as though he had to choose his next words very carefully. "Because, if I don't, then who will?" For what felt like a very long moment there was silence. Not even the Kyuubi's breathing seemed to break the sudden void of noise for a deafening second. Finally though, it turned its enormous head, staring intently at the boy for a while before grunting and lowering its head back onto its paws. "So what is it you want from me exactly? A testament? A confession?" Naruto looked up at the fox, trying to puzzle out just what he was seeing in the old being's face at that moment. Resignation? Acceptance? He might never find out. "How about your story?" He saw the fox raise its brow a little as there was another quiet pause before it slowly nodded just once. "Very well, Rinnegan, we will see what you think when I am finished." Chapter 21. Lightning Part 2. Your present circumstances don't determine where you can go, they merely determine where you start. Nito Quabain. Around 1,000 of your Rinnegan years ago there was a man, likened to a traveling holy man similar to the monks of today. Naruto grinned at that, already having a feeling for who the Kyuubi was talking about. "Like me." The great fox merely leveled an irritated gaze at him, clearly telling him to shut up. However, he was far more than just a monk. He could see things others couldn't, use powers others found impossible. It took him a great many years to understand his abilities. By the time he was done, a great evil had arose in the lands he lived in. It is greatly simplified, but the most you need to know is that it was a terrible beast known only as the Jubi. Naruto blinked at that, remembering back to the time he had been first told of the sage and that illustrated monster he was fighting. Many events occurred that are a long story for a different time, however it culminated with the sage defeating the monster, sealing its energy within himself and becoming the first Jinchuriki. Naruto was also surprised by that and couldn't help but start drawing parallels between himself and the sage. He became known as a great hero, hailed by many as a god for his unworldly abilities that even before becoming a Jinchuriki surpassed many of your so-called legendary shinobi of today. The fox snorted to himself, even Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha paled in comparison to the power held by the long-dead sage. However, even the sage had his limits like all you ninja, and eventually, despite the overwhelming power he had accumulated, he was forced to face his own mortality. He feared that the creature he had kept locked away within his body would be released upon his death, so he took precautions. When he was old and frail, merely a shadow of his former self, he released the energy within him, shaping it and molding it into 9 separate beings. At that, Naruto gained a sudden look of understanding, to which the Kyuubi only nodded once. You aren't as simple as you appear, Ninjin. Yes, all 9 Biju are simply an aspect of our progenitor, the Jubi, given new form and mind. As a final precaution, the sage sealed the great beast's body within an enormous construct of stone before throwing it into the sky. I believe your kind call it the moon. Naruto at this point nearly had his jaw on the ground. In a figurative sense, everything he was being told was just incredible. Wait, that actually happened. The Kyuubi just narrowed his eyes at the small blonde, daring him to interrupt again. Yes, the sage's power even on his deathbed was unrivaled. I believe he used the land that once occupied what you know as Mizu no Kuni. The fox seemed somewhat repulsed. He was forcing himself to use these human terms just to tell his story. However, that is irrelevant. Shortly after giving us life, the sage succumbed to his own humanity, leaving only a legacy in the form of his 2 sons, progenitors of the Senju, and the fox grimaced as if the next words might poison his mouth. Uchiha clans. The beast took a moment, seemingly trying to rid himself of the foul taste that word left in his mouth. For a time, there was peace. Many remembered the teachings the sage had passed on in his times. Slowly the shinobi system as you know it today came into existence as people twisted ninjutsu into weapons, with more and more ninjin learning to harness chakra as the sage once had. Of course, all paled in comparison to what he had been, but that never stopped your pitiful kind from trying. The fox let out a low rumbling sigh as he dropped his head back onto his paws, its eyes losing focus slightly as it remembered the times back then. Then, as ninjin always inevitably do, your kind tried to reach beyond their grasp. Tales of the sage faded into legend and myth, and the origin of my own kind was lost to the devilish tongue of man. You kind sought mine out, looking to kill us and be proclaimed heroes for vanquishing us like the demons you saw us as. You could not comprehend our power, so naturally you either tried to take it from us, or extinguish what you could not understand. The fox sighed loudly, suddenly sounding more like a weary old man than an impossibly powerful construct of chakra. I was forced to watch as one by one the rest of the Biju were enslaved or captured, forced into vessels of human flesh and bone. However, I was unconcerned. My power was much greater than theirs, my tails greater in number, my pride was my downfall. I believed myself to be the greatest being in existence since the sage himself. The Kyuubi's furred fist slammed down suddenly with rage in its eyes as it glared at Naruto, or more specifically the race he represented. And I still am. It took a deep rumbling breath before settling back down on its stomach, the fire still burning in its eyes. However, even the mighty fall when they underestimate their opponent. I was foolish enough to believe that the single ninjin that dared challenge me was just like the rest of your kind, destined to be crushed beneath my tails. However, Madara Uchiha, again it spit the word out like it didn't even deserve to taint its tongue. Possessed something the rest did not, the Sharingan. The great fox growled lowly as Naruto remembered his time in Konoha, those people with the red eyes who would glare at him just like the rest of the village. An aberration of the sage's dujutsu that he used to enslave me in the most humiliating manner. That cursed man forced me to fight his battles like some common pet. By now the Kyuubi's eyes were alight with rage, its tail swaying ominously. However, he too overstepped his bounds, fighting a man greater than himself, your Shodaime Hokage. Like with Madara, the Kyuubi didn't seem to like the taste of that all too much, however he spoke with slightly less spite. Then, like the rest of my kind before me, I was imprisoned, chained down in a vessel of blood and ink. That lasted for a few more decades, and when I finally smelt my freedom in the form of my jailer's death, it was ripped from me. I was traded to a new host, passed down like some piece of jewelry you ninjas find so fascinating. I did not believe it was possible, but the next decade proved to be even worse than before. The fox rubbed its paw lightly as if remembering some phantom injury. I was chained in the dark, impaled all over my body with those accursed chains, unable to even move. When I finally tasted freedom, I only awoke to find myself sealed inside of you, some frail pathetic child that couldn't even stand under its own power. It glared at Naruto for a moment, but the blonde didn't even blink. Then I discovered that this jail was different. I could catch fleeting glimpses of the outside world. The creature snarled for a moment, looking away into the darkness of its cell. You say I attacked your village. The Kyuubi snorted loudly in both disgust and sickening amusement before returning its steady gaze to the blonde. I don't remember it, but I assure you I would have taken the utmost satisfaction in destroying your wretched village for my humiliating imprisonment. There was a long silence before Naruto realized the Kyuubi was finished. It just lay there with its head on its paws, staring at the young monk intently. Naruto stood up from where he had been sitting cross-legged, making the Kyuubi raise its brow slightly in curiosity. The blonde simply walked forward, leaving his shikuju behind on the ground as he walked right up to the bars of the Kyuubi's cage. He didn't stop there though. In a move that surprised the great fox, the young monk slipped through the bars and continued walking forward, all the way until he was right in front of the fox's enormous muzzle, never once breaking eye contact. Finally he stopped, smiling lightly at the fox, which only looked back with steeled and wary features. I am Naruto Uzumaki, monk of the Fire Temple in Hai no Kuni. I cannot speak for the entirety of my race, nor can I profess that they would even support me if I did. However, I would like to offer my most sincere apology for you and your kind's treatment. And with that the young blonde bowed, his head touching the floor in a fully submissive pose before the great Biju. The fox thought about how easy it would be to simply crush the human. A flick of its paw, a sweep of its tail, it would be no harder than swatting a fly. Of course he would have to wait a year or two for his body to reform and a decade more for his full strength to return, but the possibility was certainly there. This young boy, barely out of his childhood, was bowed before him, not as a servant or in any form of fear, but as an offer of trust. The great fox would deny it if ever asked again, but at that exact moment its maw slipped into the smallest of smiles before immediately returning to its neutral grimace. The Kyuubi merely snorted once, the winds nearly bowling the young blonde over. Stop bowing, ninja. One who bears the sage's eyes should not debase themselves like that. Naruto immediately stood up, the small but genuine smile still present at not being crushed where he stood. It was a gamble he had taken, but he was glad it had paid off. He felt as though this was a real turning point in his relationship with his tenant. The fox was stoic as ever, lifting its head up high over the much smaller human to look down with rather apathetic red eyes. Do not mistake my intentions, ninja. We are not friends, nor are we comrades. I do not like you, nor has my opinion been changed on your worthless race. The great fox inhaled deeply before looking away like a nobleman might when forced to apologize about something. They would do it, but that certainly didn't mean they would like it. However, I will admit you are somewhat different than the rest of your kind. Now leave my cell before I change my mind and crush you like a speck of dust. Naruto just nodded, still maintaining that smile as he quickly slipped back between the bars. The blonde returned to his sitting position by his shikuju, amusedly drumming his fingers along the wooden staff. So different in a good or bad way. By now the fox had returned to lying on its stomach, not even bothering to face the small blonde anymore. Naruto just figured it was acting more aloof than usual to compensate for its momentary lapse of not being the pinnacle of destruction and rage. It turned its head so that one narrowed red eye calmly gazed at the young monk. We shall see, ninja. Naruto sighed a little. He had hoped the Kyuubi would at least call him by his name now, but it seemed the great fox was still just as stubborn as ever. Any chance of me learning your name then? The fox snorted loudly. However, for once it wasn't in abject disdain or indignation, it was more of a neutral snort. Naruto blinked for a moment at how ridiculous that sounded even in his own head, but when the Kyuubi's main go-to response was a snort or a growl, he had to start discerning meanings in them. Do not push your already frail luck, ninja. Now be gone, this has grown tiresome. Naruto just gave a curt nod with the same small smile before fading from the seal, taking Shukaku's cage with him to leave the Kyuubi in darkened solitude. It slunk back into its lonely cell, curling up around itself on the floor, closer to the gate than it usually did. He is an unusual one, it seems he has inherited more than simply Urai's father. The next week for the trio was fairly peaceful. Naruto noticed they were still watched by the Anbu, but he didn't mind that too much, they weren't actually doing anything wrong after all. However, what the special ops members didn't know was that they were mostly following Hanged Shadow clones around all day. It had worked in Suna, so Naruto saw no reason why it wouldn't work in Kumo. It turned out he was right. During the day he would divide his time between helping out Shizuku where he could with her elemental training, trying to master his own lightning exercise and sparring with Fu. In the evening he would send a shadow clone to help out at various shinobi supply stores, cleaning up for what money the shopkeepers could offer him. It wasn't a great amount, but it was at least enough to tide them over on their journeys. Right now they didn't have to buy much, although Naruto sometimes felt guilty for playing on the old monk's hospitality. Currently he was sitting in that same plateau that had become somewhat of a favorite training ground of his in the short time he had been in Kumo. Omoi had come by a few more times as well. They would talk, he would exaggerate, and the young shinobi would talk to him about his village, his teammates and the like. Nothing classified or that could be considered dangerous, just generic banter more for the sake of conversation more than anything else. The two had become quick friends. Naruto missed having a guy friend to talk to, being surrounded by two girls all day every day. Fu was nearby, practicing a familiar hand seal as increasingly healthy, but still frail clones appeared next to her, only to be banished away in clouds of smoke. Naruto had figured with a Jinchuriki's stamina and reserves the shadow clone technique would suit Fu well. There was also the fact she was not limited with how many she could produce like Naruto was, meaning if she was careful with the mental feedback she could use them for training. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Another large puff echoed around the plateau as a slightly pale and shaky Fu appeared next to the original. Naruto smiled at her accomplishment, she had finally made one that could stand, she was definitely getting closer. She had been working at it for the last 2 hours. Of course Naruto had gotten it down in one, but he had the benefit of having Sora challenge him to see who could master it first. Naturally he had come away the victor from that little challenge. He had the advantage of being the full Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi, not just its chakra. He just continued on with his lighting manipulation. By now he could separate his hands by about 1.5 feet with a few healthy arcs of lightning bouncing between his palms. He might have been imagining things, but he could have sworn each element was becoming easier to master as they went along. Perhaps he was just getting used to separating his chakra into the individual elements, or maybe with each element he mastered it was simpler to separate the remaining ones out of his normal chakra. After a while Fu walked over, looking rather haggard from the intense chakra usage, with a victorious smirk on her features as she sank to the ground beside him. That is truly an impressive technique. I can't imagine how fast one could learn something using their memory feedback. Naruto just nodded as another bright arc of electricity jumped between his hands like a little azure laser. Yeah, but you have to be careful. Sora got really bad headaches when he let too many clones dispel at once. The blonde chuckled at the memory. His friend had practically been comatose the next day, but at least he had learned a valuable lesson about restraint. Fu just nodded in understanding, falling onto her back from the exhaustion. Even as a Jinchuriki, splitting her chakra so many times between clones was tiring. She was sure she would be feeling the strain she had put on her pathways in the morning, advanced healing or not. I'm surprised more people don't attempt the training method. The possible gains seem to outweigh the dangers. Naruto let his arms drop, wincing a little as a stray bolt of lightning arced out and burned his arm slightly at his loss of control. Maybe for me and you, but from what I've seen Jinchuriki seem to be a somewhat special case. I don't really know how to describe it, but our chakra seems denser than others. It means we can split it more safely as our bodies can operate with less than others. Normal people can't, so they're limited to maybe 20 clones at the very most. Beyond that it's just dangerous. There's also the problem of maintaining them long enough to be of any use. The longest I've ever held a clone is about 10 hours, beyond that they seem to become unstable. Add that to their frailty and they lose their value as training tools. Fu just nodded understandably. Despite her status as Jinchuriki feeling like a curse most of the time, she could at least accept it gave her certain advantages over others. I understand, from what you describe they seem more suited for reconnaissance. Naruto just nodded, from what Chiriku had told him that was exactly what they were for. Suddenly the two were interrupted by a scrabbling sound. They turned to see Shizuku descending the mountain towards them rather quickly, an excited look on her face. She skidded to a stop in front of them, panting slightly from running but grinning all the same. Naruto, I found them. The aforementioned blonde just quirked an eyebrow as the girl straightened up, catching her second wind before elaborating. You know, you told us about that sage guy, the one who had the Rinnegan before you. Naruto winced at how loudly she had said it. Luckily the Anbu were off chasing his shadow clones, but Shizuku probably didn't know that. You said he had a lot of objects that he put his power into, like your staff. The blonde wanted to correct the girl that it was a shikuju, not a staff, however he was too interested in where this was going to stop her. Well, they're here. In Kumo. The blonde just blinked in surprise before asking the obvious, getting to his feet from his cross-legged position in the process. How do you know? Shizuku smiled proudly as she produced a small leaflet from a pouch of hers she kept around her waist. Naruto looked it over quickly. It just seemed to be an ordinary museum pamphlet, advertising the various attractions the place had to offer. There were exhibits on the origins of Kumo, a weapons display from the Warring Clans period, and a special exhibit on the Sage of the Six Paths. He looked up in surprise only to see a grinning Shizuku, almost looking like a dog waiting for its master to pat it on the head. Wow, great find, Shizuku. He moved forward, quickly sweeping the girl into a spinning hug, much to her embarrassment and Fu's unnoticed chagrin. He finally set the blushing girl down to reread the pamphlet, but it didn't have much more information besides the times the museum was open. Did you get a look at anything? Shizuku quickly shook her head, still looking a little red from the unexpected hug. No, I ran right over here when I found out. Naruto just nodded absently as he continued to scour the leaflet. Fu walked across the small plateau, glancing over his shoulder at the piece of paper before staring at his shikuju. Why would Kumo keep something as powerful as the sage's tools in a museum? Why not actually use them? Naruto finally looked up from the pamphlet, a small grin on his face as he shook his shikuju lightly, getting it to jingle. Well, if they're anything like this, then hardly anybody would be able to hold them, never mind use them. Really only a Kage, a Jinchuriki or a Rinnegan user would be able to properly use them. Fu just nodded. She had once held Naruto's staff out of curiosity, and despite her enormous reserves she was sure even an hour holding that simple wooden staff would drain her dry. It made her appreciate it all the more that Naruto could carry it around all day with no visible drain on his chakra. It was truly made for a Rinnegan user. But Kumo has two Jinchuriki as far as the other countries are aware, the Nibi no Nekomata and the Hachibi no Kyogyu. Naruto just shrugged. He couldn't really say why the village wouldn't utilize such powerful tools. Maybe the tools just don't fit with their fighting styles. Nobody really had an answer for him. They knew just as much as he did on the subject. Perhaps he could get something out of the Kyuubi, but he was being especially sullen and unresponsive lately. It was actually rather amusing to see the great fox acting petulantly. Well, I guess we know where we'll find the answers. The Kumo Museum was a surprisingly small building, until of course you realized that since it was built into a mountain most of the exhibits were in the lower levels. It did stick out a little though, being built out of a shining white marble as opposed to the normal gray-hued materials the rest of Kumo was constructed from. You could tell the whole place was built for the express purpose of attracting tourists. There was even a little gift shop selling replica headbands and other Kumogakure memorabilia. Inside it was cool and well ventilated to make up for the sometimes cramped spaces filled with people that would otherwise make it stiflingly hot. The Sage of the Six Paths exhibit was on the lowest accessible level of the museum, everything below it being maintenance or storage. The trio had a surprisingly good time looking through the other displays. Naruto especially enjoyed a display on the Hachibi and its various attacks on the village. There was even a small model of Kumo with a to-scale Hachibi in the middle of destroying it. There it is. The blonde felt a tug on his sleeve and turned to see Shizuku pointing out another hallway with a sign designating it as the sage's display. They quickly made their way inside, not really finding anything all that different. All the displays were still set into the wall or on tables in the center of the room. Naturally, Naruto gravitated over to the large panoramic window that held the tools themselves. They don't look all that impressive. Naruto found himself agreeing with Fu's hushed whisper. It was an odd collection of items. The first was possibly the most impractical sword Naruto had ever seen, the label marking it as the Shichiseiken. It was a wide metal blade that folded around a thin central metal pole. The information mentioned something about severing, word souls, or something of the like. It didn't make a lot of sense to the young monk. Next along was the Kukenju, a long golden rope, supposedly used to bind and draw out one's word soul with some kind of verbal command. Again, Naruto was confused by the phrase, wondering just what a word soul was. It seemed there was no actual information on it. Obviously Kumo didn't want people knowing how their treasured tools worked. The blonde just shook his head. Communication was the first step towards understanding. Hoarding knowledge never ended well historically. The item after that was a large crimson gourd that reminded Naruto a little of Gaara's sand container, except it didn't have a Suna headband wrapped around the middle. It was the Beni Hisago and apparently completed the word soul trio, capturing them within itself after they were severed and drawn out. In all, they seemed like strange group of items, and it looked like you would need all three to get any use out of them. However, due to the bulky gourd and unwieldy sword that seemed highly impractical, it would make more sense for two people working in tandem. The fourth item was different to the rest, an enormous and colorful fan made of unidentifiable bird feathers, the Bashausen. It confused Naruto though, as the description said it allowed the user to generate all 5 chakra natures. That made no sense. Due to the Rinnegan, Naruto was already able to use all 5 elements. Why would the sage need this? The more Naruto thought about it, the more he began to think these tools were not actually for the sage. He wondered if they had been gifts like his own Shikuju had been at one point. He feared he might never get an answer though. Finally, there was the item in the center of the room, cordoned off by both velvet ropes and a thick layer of glass. It was a huge stone purifying pot with a thick white rope wrapped around the top and a stylized version of the kanji for lightning imprinted on it. Naruto quickly guessed the mark was more recently added. The pot was supposed to be able to seal anything inside, merging it with the liquid inside. In fact, it had been used on 3 separate occasions to capture the Hachibi before it was transferred to a new Jinchuriki. Yeah, the only thing that looks useful is the fan, and you can already use all 5 elements. Shizuku suddenly spoke from his left, looking intently at the large stone pot. Naruto just chuckled at his 2 companions looking at each object with curious gazes. Actually, none of these are of any use to me. The 2 girls just looked around, blinking in confusion. I don't understand, they were created by the sage of the 6 paths, they have to have at least some use. Naruto just shook his head, motioning with his arms in a sweeping gesture that encompassed the room. No, I mean all of these are fake, there's no chakra in them. Fu and Shizuku just nodded in understanding. If there was anybody who could tell if something belonged to the sage or not, it was Naruto. I see, these must be replicas. The real ones are most likely better protected somewhere else. Naruto just nodded. He had been thinking the same thing as Fu. There was no way Kumo would just leave all the treasured tools out like this, even with the security and barrier seals on all the glass. Naruto simply shrugged as he began to walk for the exit, having lost interest in the fake display. Fu and Shizuku quickly followed him, and soon the trio were outside the museum, sitting on a low bench across the street. So how are we supposed to learn anything about the sage if the items on display are all fakes? Not surprisingly, it was Shizuku who posed the innocent question, quickly met by matching smirks from Fu and Naruto. The purple-haired girl just groaned into her hands. She could already imagine what her friends were thinking. Can we please not make another enemy out of a hidden village? Naruto just shrugged while Fu didn't seem to care in the slightest. Then again, she was already being hunted by one hidden village. Ah, you worry too much, Shizuku. The girl just looked at the blonde with a stern expression which made the boy grin sheepishly. You're planning on stealing the tools, aren't you? It wasn't really a question, so Naruto didn't really feel like answering. He just got up off the bench and started walking back to the temple. Fu quickly followed him while Shizuku just looked at the two with her eye twitching slightly. Naruto. The boy just kept walking, waving back to the Miko-esque girl cheekily. Naruto. She raced after him. She already knew whatever he had planned would be a bad idea. Shizuku was right, it was a bad idea. Thankfully Naruto didn't plan on attempting to steal a practical national treasure of Kumo, at least not yet. For one, they didn't know where said treasures even were, the real ones, and they had no idea what kind of protection they might have. Of course that only made the blonde monk see it as a kind of challenge, something that only increased Shizuku's fears. She knew that when Naruto had a goal he would move heaven and earth to see it accomplished. That did not bode well for them if Kumo ever found out what they were planning. However, right now everything was returning to normal. Naruto was still practicing his lightning manipulation, having recently gotten the second stage from Omoi. Shizuku was still refining her control over water, and Fu was doing whatever it was Fu did. Honestly, the mint-haired girl was a little bit of a mystery to Shizuku. She would wander off into Kumo off half the day only to come back around lunch, spar with Naruto until she was tired, then wander off again. Shizuku had no idea what the girl did or where she went. As far as she could tell, Fu just liked her peace and quiet. The Violette figured it was her own way of proving her independence after having her every move controlled by Taki. Unfortunately, right now Fu seemed rather aimless. She lacked a goal other than to follow Naruto and protect him. It was obvious though she was looking for something, trying to find a purpose in her life where she previously had none of her own. Shizuku's inner monologue was cut short as Naruto strode into the temple, a large grin on his face as he walked forward, picked Shizuku up into a brief hug and span her around before walking on into another room. The girl had to shake off her sudden goofy trance at the intimate hug before quickly following Naruto into the other room where he was muttering to himself quietly but energetically, almost like he was having a conversation with himself. Naruto. As much as I enjoyed the hug, can you tell me why? The blonde just looked around with the same victorious grin. For a moment Shizuku feared, and somewhat didn't mind, that he might pull her into another embrace. I've got it, I know how we can get the tools. Shizuku blinked. She might have been against attempting to steal priceless relics from a very powerful hidden village, but she couldn't help but be interested. It didn't help that Naruto had naturally infectious good moods and she was getting swept away in his glowing grin. Really, how? If anything, his smile stretched even wider, his steely purple eyes almost glowing with chakra. I'm going to learn how to turn invisible. Chapter 22, Lightning Part 3. The only way of finding the limits of the possible are by going beyond them into the impossible. Arthur C. Clarke. Agish. This is impossible. Naruto sat dejectedly in his favorite training ground, his hands clasped in the ram seal which was supposed to aid the drawing out and subconscious molding of chakra. Fu sat to one side, calmly reading through a scroll on the basic fundamentals of chakra. Naruto had found she was the type who always reverted to studying the basics when she was stuck on what to do. Without any access to jutsu scrolls or taijutsu techniques and without Naruto being willing to spar, she didn't have much else to do. Then are you going to look for another way? Naruto just shot Fu a pointed look that clearly said he wasn't. Of course not, I'm going to find a way to turn invisible if it's the last thing I do. Fu just tilted her head in that same cutely innocent way that just spoke of how little she had been taught when she was younger. But didn't you just say it was impossible? Naruto sighed slightly, leaning back on his hands and catching himself before he ran a hand through his hair, that was becoming somewhat of a habit lately. It's just the frustration talking. I know it's possible, that old pervert back in Uno Kuni could do it. That's part of where I got the idea from in the first place. Fu quirked an eyebrow but didn't say anything else, preferring to return to her scroll. She took solace in her reading. In fact, most days they spent in Kumo now she would devote at least a few hours in the public library. To her it didn't particularly matter what she read, as long as it allowed her to escape her world and memories for just a few hours. She had particularly taken to fantasy novels, enjoying the action and otherworldly adventure the protagonists got up to. In a way she could sometimes relate her own life to some of the stories, the lonely maiden in a destitute and unfair life, whisked away by the cavalier prince on a mystical adventure. Of course she didn't quite understand many of the aspects in these stories, the romance in particular both confounded and intrigued her. She didn't understand why people skirted around issues such as love or attraction. Then again, having never particularly felt those emotions, at least to her knowledge, she found she couldn't relate all that well. She had a lot of time to read lately, what with Naruto taking upon himself the crusade of becoming invisible. It was something he had been trying and finding only partial success in for the past 2 weeks. It was sometimes both amusing and incredible what the boy would come up with in an attempt to circumvent vision. More so as his ideas become more and more ludicrous with each passing, and failing, attempt. His first answer had obviously been genjutsu. Unfortunately there already existed many countermeasures to such methods. He had the chakra control for it, as well as the imagination, however he just simply wasn't skilled enough to fool anybody above Chunin level. It wasn't a fault of his own, but the skill took a lot of time and dedication to master, time he didn't really have and couldn't replicate with shadow clones fast enough. His next attempt had been slightly more basic, an adapted version of the henge that could literally change as he moved. It worked to an extent. He simply hanged every part of his body into an image of what was behind him. Surprisingly, the problem did not lie in the chakra control, although it was extraordinarily high. It was the fact he could just simply not think quickly enough to compensate for the changing image. Therefore there was slight lag in the technique. It wasn't noticeable if he was moving slowly, but it would give him away at even a normal walk. Fu had been interested in it however, even though she lacked the immense control required to use it, likening it to how a chameleon worked. That was when the blonde's next bout of inspiration hit, quickly summoning a chameleon to study only to be surprised to find they too had a summoning contract. Interestingly though, their boss summon had not been seen in quite some time and their last summoner had died, meaning the contract scroll itself was lost to them. Most had long since believed they would never be summoned again, prompting them to be quite accepting of the young monk. He had studied with one of their kind for a while, a large chameleon by the name of Shiroshiku that was about the size of a large dog. Unfortunately the lizard had no real idea how their own pseudo-invisibility worked. It was more of an instinctual power like Naruto's Rinnegan abilities. However, even though they became completely invisible and their chakra signature vanished, they still had a weak scent, which mean they weren't completely undetectable if someone worked at trying to find them. Near the end of that particular venture, Shiroshiku had suggested Naruto could just summon a larger chameleon and hide inside of it. Needless to say, Naruto quickly but politely turned that proposition down, saving it for a last resort. Even though it turned out to be a dead end, Naruto had made rather good friends with the chameleons, promising that if he ever discovered their leader, Shiromari, he would do what he could to send him back home. Next, Naruto had turned to space-time ninjutsu, that was quickly abandoned as well. He had quickly discovered that the sheer skill, time, and patience that went into creating such a complex and powerful technique was just staggering. His original intention was to create a technique that was able to somehow teleport the light hitting him to the other side of his body, effectively rendering him invisible to normal light. However, while that was a dead end, or at least such a long end that it might as well be dead, it did give him other ideas. Instead of subverting the light like he had planned, he began to toy with the idea of bending light around his body. There were certain impracticalities associated with it though, highest on the list being that it would render him completely blind for the duration of the technique. Naturally, no light hitting his body also meant no light hitting his eyes, meaning he wouldn't be able to see. He didn't expect a floating set of eyes would be all that discreet, however he stuck with the idea for a while. He found there were actually a few ways to bend light, such as the fact it was subject to gravity like anything else in the universe. However, the extra forces of gravity required to bend light to any useful degree would probably start rending the planet before he could get any use out of it. He put that in the Plan B column. He also knew you could refract light through certain mediums, that in particular interested him. For the first time in probably too long, Naruto began to think about the properties of chakra again. He supposed that it was a substance of sorts, it could be visible in high enough concentrations like a gas, it could flow and move like water, it could even be corrosive and poisonous at the extreme end of the spectrum. He began to experiment with it, manipulating his chakra into a thin covering around his hands, trying to find the exact point when it became visible. He had almost shouted out in victory as he noticed a slight distortion around his hand. The chakra was actually refracting the light to a certain degree. Now it was just a matter of finding a point at which he could cloak his entire body in it, all at the correct angles that he would probably have to be adjusting on the fly as he moved, and therein lay his problem. He had certainly found a method of turning invisible, without the noticeable drawback of the others, but for once it was actually his control letting him down. That was why he was currently on the verge of ripping his hair out in his training ground, his arms semi-translucent and rippling like water as he manipulated the chakra, covering it like a shroud. At least one good thing about this technique was that it didn't actually waste any chakra. When he was finished, he could simply reabsorb the thin layer around his body. It meant he could train literally as long as he was awake, which he had been doing for the past 5 days. Right now he was actually thinking of ways he could extend how long he could stay awake, mostly to avoid having to think about the impossibly difficult task he had set himself. He sighed again in abject frustration as he lost control, more of his forearm returning to the visible spectrum. So far only his fingertips could stay completely invisible. It was actually rather unnerving as it looked like they had been chopped off. Right now though, Naruto was just trying to extend the technique over his entire body, as opposed to just one arm. It hadn't all just been one frustration after another though. Naruto had interestingly found out that at the perfect angle chakra didn't just refract light. He couldn't explain the physics behind it, nor probably would he ever. But it seemed chakra was a rather unique medium. Just like it technically lacked form until molded or gathered in high enough quantities, it also lacked any kind of smell. That meant that when using the technique, if he could ever get it to work properly, he wouldn't just be rendered invisible, but nigh undetectable. Only sound or touch would give him away, and Naruto could already use chakra to muffle his movements to a certain degree. Fu looked up from her scroll as Naruto groaned in frustration yet again. She couldn't decide whether or not his determination in the face of such odds was amusing or admirable. She would never have the control to even attempt what the young monk was trying to do, never mind come up with the concept or a reasonable method to achieve it. Watching Naruto go through idea after idea without once even thinking of giving up had been somewhat of an eye-opener for her. She wanted that, she wanted a goal to believe in so much she would do anything to get it. Perhaps you just need to rest, give yourself some time to relax and think things through. The vedette was actually rather surprised she had spoken, having preferred to stay quiet most of the time and simply observe the blonde as he practiced. However, he just looked so wound up and agitated that she couldn't help but intervene. She had seen it many times with shinobi on teams she had been assigned to. Frustration only led to a lack in concentration, and that led to mistakes. "I can't stop now. I know I'm close to a breakthrough." He spoke with such passion that it brought a small smile to the mint-haired Jinchuriki's face. She tucked her scroll away, having already read it more than a few times through, and walked over to him, laying a soft hand on his shoulder. "If you remain stressed, you will only continue to frustrate yourself. After training one's muscles, you must give them time to recuperate. The mind and the chakra system are no different." Naruto was about to argue with the girl, but there was something about the way she spoke that made him falter. She didn't speak with condescension or like she knew what was best for him. She only recommended as a friend with his best interests in heart. He sighed at her soft, steady voice and nodded with a small smile, getting to his feet and stretching out his stiff back with a satisfying click. "Maybe you're right, I think I'll go for a walk. Omoi told me there are some impressive sights just outside of the village, and with all this training I never really got around to checking them out." He grinned at the caramel-skinned girl, eliciting a warm feeling in her stomach she couldn't explain. It made her wonder if she was ill or something. She just nodded with a small smile and began to walk back to the temple. The only reason she was out here was to watch Naruto's progress. She much preferred to read somewhere quiet and homely. Naruto found himself wandering rather aimlessly. His thoughts were still transfixed on the problem that had been eluding him for the past week. He knew he was supposed to be relaxing for the express purpose of losing those thoughts, at least for a little while, but ingrained habits don't break that easily. However, as engrossed in his thoughts as he was still able to cast an appreciative eye about his surroundings. It was one of the many places Omoi had recommended to him in their conversations, among various onsen, a large hanging garden, one of the oldest shrines in the elemental nations, and the enormous stadium where Kumo hosted their Chunin exams. It was built out of the hollowed-out crater of a large dormant volcano. However, Naruto had decided first to visit what had been affectionately dubbed the Stone Garden. It was a network of enormous stone pillars that rose up out of an even larger lake, surrounded on all four sides by some of the largest mountains in Kaminari no Kuni. Some were pointed at the top while others were flat or even blossomed out like rocky mushrooms. It really was an impressive place to just wander through, especially considering Naruto had the luxury of simply walking across the water's surface. It gave him a unique perspective to look up at the towering pillars and spikes of stone. He continued to wander and think, drawing a random path through the almost labyrinthine network of pillars until he found himself near the center of the construct. He met a strange sight there, what looked to be possibly the remains of one of the stone pillars, a perfectly circular slab of rock just above the water level. Behind it a set of ornate stone steps with bright golden barriers flanking them as they climbed the mountain behind it to a small temple. Curious, Naruto climbed the stairs, feeling the lingering chakra of whoever had been training here. They were obviously very powerful to leave such dense chakra hanging in the air for any amount of time. He stopped at the top, admiring the simple but well-maintained building with two canvas flaps flanking the doorway. Almost as soon as his foot touched the last step a man emerged from the building. Yo, it seems the mighty killer bees got somebody up in visiting me. Naruto raised an eyebrow at the very strange and obviously rather eccentric man before him. He had the traditional dark skin that most Kumo residents possessed as well as a large muscular build that offset his otherwise goofy appearance. He wore sunglasses with an almost all-white outfit including a flak jacket, scarf, headband, shin guards, and fingerless gloves. Other than that he wore dark blue pants and had the kanji for iron tattooed on his exposed shoulder. Hello, I didn't realize anybody was actually here, I thought the temple was empty. It was a small lie but he didn't need this man knowing he could sense the lingering chakra in the air. Standing in front of him though Naruto realized why rather quickly, he was a Jinchuriki. There was no disguising it, or at least the man lacked the control to disguise it. Biju chakra was radiating from him in waves, he had obviously been practicing with it recently. Man, you must be a real out-of-towner, now ain't that a downer, cause everybody would agree this is the home of the mighty killer bee. As the man talked he would occasionally move his head or arms to a beat only he seemed to be able to hear, it was actually rather amusing. It's nice to meet you, Kurabi. Naruto inclined his head slightly, it would do good to make a nice first impression on his fellow Jinchuriki. Surprisingly though the large man placed a hand on his shoulders with a beaming grin on his bearded features. Now little monk, get out of that funk cause there's no need for the pleasantry between us fellow Jinchuriki, ya fool. He bobbed his head to the silent beat again making Naruto smirk before grinning sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his neck. Huh, really that obvious? The large man just nodded with his own smirk, eyes sparkling with amusement behind his dark shades. Oh yeah, mighty Hachibi-sama's brewing up some real drama when he felt he host of Mr. 9 approach our little shrine. Naruto raised a surprised eyebrow at that. He didn't realize he could not only detect he was a Jinchuriki, but for which Biju. He was just glad the Kyuubi's presence seemed to override Shukaku's, that might have thrown up some awkward questions he wasn't sure how to answer. He wondered if the Kyuubi could sense his fellow Biju in the same way. So you can talk to the Hachibi. Kurabi just nodded as he began to walk inside the temple, Naruto quickly following him. Inside it was surprisingly spacious, the entire room hollowed out of the mountain stone. The blonde had a feeling Kurabi had not built this place himself, there were many murals on the wall, some of the Hachibi and a few of what he could only assume was the Nibi. Yeah, me and Hachibi-sama have faced all kinds of trauma, we're partners you see making me the perfect Jinchuriki, ya fool. Naruto ignored the last part as he thought about what he meant by a perfect Jinchuriki and if he could attain that. So you and the Hachibi have a good relationship. Kurabi nodded again in his strange manner with his arms crossed and his body leant back slightly. At first me and the Hachibi were all fighting and was ma enemy but we got ta some serious rappin' and I found out he didn't like I was trappin', we. Naruto just nodded, the Kyuubi had told him many times of his dislike of being caged inside a worthless ninja. So we worked out a deal Hachibi-sama and me, and the rest is history cause we're the mighty Eight Tails and Killer Bee. Ya fool. The large man just stood there for a moment, as if basking in the cheers of some invisible crowd which the blonde actually found rather unnerving. So Mr. 9, you be looking mighty fine, why'd you come find the killer bee when last I heard you were in the big tree? Naruto could only assume Kurabi meant Konoha by that, with his strange manner of talking he could only guess these things. He suddenly had an epiphany that this must be the bee sensei Omoi talked about, small world. Actually I had no idea you were here. A friend told me this place was a good spot to visit and I was frustrated about something, so I came out here to relax. Kurabi just nodded again in that same eccentric manner as the two sat down on the floor, both in cross-legged positions. Naruto could tell from his ease at the position that the large Jinchuriki was no stranger to meditation, at least if his posture was anything to go by. It may have also had something to do with finding a comfortable position to sit in with 7 swords strapped to his back. Ain't no place fresher to clear your head and no place better to get ma rhymes read, we. Naruto just nodded. He had noticed as he walked that the air just felt cleaner around here. It was like his mind had been in a haze before and it had only just begun to clear. He felt refreshed and rejuvenated after all the tension of the last week's training. The blonde looked up, unsure of how to broach his next topic. Honestly, he hadn't expected to run into one of the Jinchuriki of the village so soon. So, how is it in Kumo? It was an innocent question, but he got a feeling Kurabi understood what the young monk was trying to say. In essence, he was asking if the older Jinchuriki had been mistreated. As far as the blonde could tell, having to come so far out of the village for peace wasn't a good sign. Well, ain't that cute, little Nine be worried about the killer bee. Well, you don't have to because nobody would be hurtin' on me. Ya fool. Naruto just nodded with a pleasant smile. It was good to meet at least one Jinchuriki who wasn't hated by their village. His previous conceptions about Kumo before coming hadn't been all that good, tainted by Konoha propaganda. There were the last wars, the Hyuga incident, and a few others that put them in a bad light in Konoha. However, after living there he realized it was just like everywhere else, with people just trying to get by in life. I'm glad. B nodded in his half-sagely, half-rapper way, looking off at some invisible crowd even though Naruto knew his eyes were firmly on the blonde beneath his shades. Yo little monk, you look a little down, you saying it was the leaf that made you frown? Naruto just smiled wanly as he leaned back on his hands. He hadn't had any contact with Konoha in over 5 years. With a start he realized it had really been that long since he had run away from his former home. No, I have a good life, strong bonds with my friends, and a stubborn but at least knowledgeable fox in my gut. Anyway, I've mostly been on the road for the past year. The leaf hasn't had anything to do with my frowns for a long time. He chuckled at that but kept it as vague as he could. He wanted to trust his fellow Jinchuriki, but this wasn't Fu. Kurabi did not hate his village and was in turn not hated. He had to remember that. While he did not agree with the whole balance of power, the Biju represented, he at least acknowledged this and didn't want to start a war between Kumo and Konoha. That's tight, yo. A good friend on your back that can help take the flak is all you need, we. Naruto just nodded with a small smile before standing up, Kurabi copying the action. I know this is asking a lot, but is there any way the Raikage won't find out about me being here? I don't want to cause a war or anything. Kurabi just smirked as he moved forward, arms still crossed over his chest. Nah man, we cool, anything else would just be cruel. Gotta stay tight with ma fellow Jinchuriki or my name ain't the mighty killer bee. We. You don't gotta worry about ma bro finding out, it's like you were never here without a doubt. He finished by moving his hand across his mouth in a zipping motion before holding his hand out, fist clenched with the knuckles facing Naruto. The blonde just gave a smile of his own before bumping fists with the eccentric, but at least friendly Kumo shinobi. It was really good meeting you, Kurabi. It's nice to see a Jinchuriki having a good life. Kurabi just nodded, sporting a similar smile as opposed to his usual grin. The two stayed and talked a little while longer, sometimes about training, sometimes about Kurabi's rapping. Naruto even mentioned Fu to him and the older Jinchuriki expressed that he would like to meet another of their small group. Naruto had parted with the dark-skinned shinobi promising to bring Fu around sometime. He honestly thought the girl needed more people to talk to besides him and Shizuku. Naruto left the stone garden feeling oddly lighter, refreshed and relaxed in comparison to how he felt earlier. He had a small but genuine smile on his face as he wandered back to the temple. It seemed a bit of rest was exactly what Naruto needed. In the next week he made astounding progress in his technique. He could now effectively cover his entire body in a thin layer of refractive chakra. Now all he needed to do was work on refining it to reduce his visibility entirely. However, as it was, he was undetectable by most means. His chakra's signature vanished, he couldn't be smelled, and when he applied a soft layer of chakra to his feet he couldn't be heard by probably anyone less than an Inuzuka. All in all, he was rather satisfied with his self-created technique. For the first time he felt like he was doing something for himself as opposed to just following in somebody else's footprints. It was liberating, and Naruto wanted to continue the feeling. He figured it would only get better once he had completed the technique. He had a lot of fun sneaking up on his companions and startling them, which continued to irk Fu. Surprisingly, he seemed to have sparked something in her after one of his little pranks, and she had resolved to find a way of counteracting Naruto's invisibility. The blonde was actually rather glad. She had been a little aimless recently, and now she had a fire behind her eyes and purpose in her step. It was relieving to see Fu finally doing something other than just sit around and read or spar, although she didn't stop doing those either. He just hoped the vedette didn't take it too far. As he wandered through the shopping district earlier, he had heard a few people talking about a sudden insect problem. They didn't need attention drawn to them when they were about to commit a crime against the village. However, it did spark Naruto's own curiosity about how the girl might go about finding somebody who couldn't be seen, smelt, or heard. He had also kept his promise and taken Fu to meet Kurabi. He couldn't say the two were instant friends, but they seemed to have an understanding. Kurabi knew never to stray too close to her past, and in turn Fu never commented on her annoyance with the way the older Jinchuriki talked. Kurabi had offered them both a few pointers on controlling their Biju chakra, however they had both declined. Naruto felt uncomfortable taking the Kyuubi's chakra when he was finally starting to see some change in the fox. He wanted to build a better foundation in the relationship between them before he went after anything like that. That was if he even needed it. The Sage of the Six Paths defeated the Jubi under his own power. Naruto had his goal already in mind. Fu, on the other hand, already had experience with her inner power. She just didn't want anything to do with it anymore. Taki had controlled her and the creature inside of her for too long. She would become strong under her own power, not on what she borrowed from somebody, or something else. Other than that, the last week had gone rather well. They all seemed in high spirits, although Naruto would emphasize, seemed. He had noticed something was up with Shizuku lately, which was why he was currently up on the roof of the temple with her, lying back on the ceramic tiles and staring up at the sky. They had both sat in relative silence for the last 5 minutes, just content to allow their eyes to roam between the various pinpricks of light. "How many do you think there are? Stars, I mean." It had been so quiet that Naruto was nearly startled when Shizuku suddenly spoke up, her soft melancholic tone affirming his suspicions she was not as happy as she appeared. He didn't turn, just kept his eyes up at the darkened sky, mostly focused on the intense white disk hanging up there. "I don't know, but I bet people have tried to count them." Shizuku absently nodded, her eyes not straying from the sky either. "I still can't believe how beautiful it looks." Naruto smiled softly. Shizuku really hadn't been happier than their time in Kumo. Being able to see the sky as opposed to dreary rain clouds was still just amazing to her now, as it was the first day. "You know, sometimes I still think that, even after all these years." It was true, there was just something peaceful about the sky, to look up at it and know that everybody else in the world saw the exact same stars, the same moon, the greatest equalizer. "Do you think I'll always have this curse?" Naruto sighed, suddenly realizing why Shizuku seemed so sad recently behind her happy demeanor. She was worried about leaving Kumo, returning to her place under the clouds where it could rain on her again. She didn't want the sky to be taken away from her now that she had a taste. "No." Shizuku sat up and looked around, a little surprised at the firmness in Naruto's tone. It was so definite, so certain. The blonde also sat up, turning to Shizuku with a small but confident smile. "What makes you so certain?" Her voice was quiet, unsure, contrasting greatly with Naruto's more secure tone. The blonde just smiled as he got up and moved closer the girl, sitting back down with an exaggerated sigh. "Remember the promise I made to you." He turned with the most brilliant and genuine smile Shizuku had ever seen on his face. "I never go back on my promises. One day you will be able to look up at the sky whenever you want and see the stars, or the sun." He turned back to the sky, the smile settling down but not losing any of its previous energy. "Hell, if I have to, I'll just take you to Kei's no Kuni. Even if it rains, you'll just be doing the residents a favor." They both chuckled at that, Shizuku finally gaining some confidence in herself, but more importantly, in Naruto. "Thanks, Naruto." The blonde just waved her off sheepishly, his smile becoming slightly more embarrassed. he still didn't do well with positive interaction with people. It's no problem, you're my friend. He was surprised when Shizuku grabbed his head, tuning it so she could look him in the eye. She hesitated for a moment as his faintly glowing purple orbs locked gazes with her own before shaking her head quickly and smiling. No really, without you I would still be in that bandit camp, or sold off to some slavers. She shuddered a little as her features once again became melancholic. Or worse. Naruto just lay a comforting hand on her shoulder which instantly brought her back around. But you saved me and showed me things I never believed I would ever get to see. Her smile became a grin as she made a sweeping gesture to the sky. Case in point. They both chuckled again before Shizuku brought Naruto's head back around to face her. So thank you Naruto. With that she leant forward and planted a small chaste kiss on his lips. When they parted both their faces had a tint of red in them and Shizuku was smiling lightly. Naruto was a little dazed by the contact which made the Violette giggle as she got to her feet carefully and climbed down. Naruto spent another 10 minutes up on the roof just thinking about things, not even noticing the absent smile playing across his lips. Chapter 23, Lightning Part 4. If you're going through hell, keep going. Winston Churchill. The darkened and quiet back room of a small inauspicious temple somewhere near the usually bustling center of Kumogakure, a single pair of glowing Rinnegan eyes cracked open. They appeared out of seemingly nowhere, just floating there at the center of the room, as if suspended by strings. It was only the faintest ripple across an almost invisible surface that gave any sign they were attached to a body of any kind. A set of shining white teeth appeared in grin that would put the Cheshire Cat to shame as the air rippled slightly again. Through his clone's eyes Naruto observed the area where he knew his actually body was. He was more than pleased to say that his chakra signature was completely gone, as if covered by some insubstantial screen. In fact, even with his Rinnegan, he was sure he would never spot himself unless he knew exactly where to look. At least he hoped that was the case as he planned on taking the artifacts tonight. If everything went to plan he would sneak into the Raikage's office, a daunting task in of itself, find out where the sage's possessions were kept and quickly leave Kuma with it. Hopefully he could do all of that without being detected long enough for he and his friends to leave the country, or at least the area around Kumo, safely. Fu and Shizuku, along with a clone of Naruto, had left the village earlier in the day. Luckily it had been enough to fool the guards as they were less concerned by people leaving than those that might be trying to break into their village. They hadn't been all that happy with leaving Naruto in the village alone, especially Shizuku, but without being able to perform the invisibility technique they couldn't offer much aid anyway. Shizuku had been especially worried for him. He had noticed, her gaze constantly flickering to him as they left. Ever since the kiss up on the roof almost a week before, things had become, not awkward, but different between them. They started to read into actions that before had seemed perfectly normal and innocent, and Naruto had begun to overthink just about everything when it came to his purple-haired companion. Even so he had ritualistically cleared his mind of all distractions tonight. He would need it for his technique. He found that the use of his camouflage technique was surprisingly dependent on his emotions, as they directly tied in with how agitated his chakra was. The thin shroud around his body needed to remain near the perfect angles to properly refract the light, so any slight disturbances could give him away to any sensors or those with a keen nose. Another problem that might give him away was sound. However, he had been practicing his ability to remain silent and, as a monk, he was rather proficient at it. His main concern would be his shikuju that, despite Fu's protests and concerns, he had insisted on taking with him. The jingling of the rings alone proved it wasn't the stealthiest tool, but it would be useful as a suppressant if he was actually caught. Anyway, Fu wouldn't have been able to carry it out of the village with her all the way to their rendezvous point, even she lacked the chakra for that. Of course Naruto had conveniently not reminded her that his clones shared his ability to use the Preta path. Naruto stepped out of the temple, the darkness of the moonless night casting the village around him into shadow. He wore a long shapeless cloak over his usual clothes. The technique was much easier with less angles to work with in the form of his arms and legs. The hood was pulled up over his face, just in case his technique failed. He didn't want to be recognized. He also wore a mask over the lower half of his face to again try and smooth out any angles on his body. Boidogakur no Jutsu. His voice was barely a whisper as, starting from his feet, his body quickly vanished from sight, only a slight ripple remaining in the air that was disguised by the darkness. His trip through the village was uneventful, if not highly nerve-wracking. He had tested his jutsu a few times on Fu and Shizuku, but there was a large difference between them and skilled Junin. He stuck to the streets in case he were to have a run-in with any roof-hopping shinobi out late. While it provided him with better cover, it meant his trip was slow-going. He at least didn't have to deal with any crowds. Kumo had a strict curfew enacted after midnight. Only shinobi were allowed out, and even they needed a valid reason if any suspicion was drawn to them by the Anbu. Even with all that, it took around 10 minutes for Naruto to reach the Raikage Tower, jutting out on its lofty mountain perch. The climb up the winding staircase to the building itself was even worse than the trip through the village. The stairs were wide enough for 2 people, but only barely. If anybody came down in the opposite direction, he would have to press himself up against the wall of the mountain and hope they didn't brush past him. He might have tried to climb straight up the mountainside, but he didn't quite trust himself to keep his invisibility jutsu up while surface clinging, at least not yet. Finally, with a small and he hoped inaudible sigh of relief, he crested the last step, quickly ducking into the building. Unfortunately, he knew that was the easy part. Now he actually had to infiltrate Akage's office, undetected. His progress through the tower was slow going as he was forced to skirt around a few shinobi and office workers on their late shift. However, he finally reached the door to the Raikage's office. It said as much in large golden lettering printed on the door. To the right of the office was a small but tidy desk. A large stack of what seemed to be completed paperwork lay to one side while a woman's head occupied the other. She was a woman in her late 20s with the dark skin that was so prevalent for Kumo and contrasting silver hair. Due to her position passed out on the desk, Naruto couldn't make out much more than that about her, but the small name placard on the desk read, Mabui. Obviously she had been working late to complete all the paperwork and had fallen asleep right there at her desk when she was finished. Naruto didn't mind, it just made his job easier as he quickly slipped inside the office, softly closing the door behind him without so much as a click. He turned around only to nearly cry out in surprise, nearly biting down on his tongue to quell the potential giveaway. The Raikage was sat at his desk, grunting with each representative on his barbell as his other hand hastily scribbled across various forms on the desk. Naruto breathed a small and once again silent sigh of relief that he hadn't been noticed. Looking around, he noted the fact there were no Anbu in the room. He found that strange. Even though it was the Kage, the strongest person in the village, he would have thought the man might want some protection. Was his ego that large? The blonde just slowly skirted around the back of the room, making absolutely sure he was making no sound whatsoever. The brawny man at the desk didn't seem to notice anything amiss. Naruto hadn't gone into this blind. He knew very well the prowess of the Yondaime Raikage. He was the current fastest man alive now that the Yondaime Hokage was dead. He was supposed to be peerless in taijutsu and speed, and his lightning cloak was said to make him nearly invulnerable to harm, even from most wind attacks, despite it being the superior element in the cycle. Naruto had no misconception. The man before him could crush him before he could even realize what was happening, which was why the element of surprise was so important. Slowly, slower than he had ever moved in his life, the young blonde crept up behind the enormous Kage, gently raising his shikuju in front of him, base level with the dark-skinned man's neck. And just like that, it was over. He gently tapped the man's neck with the base of his staff. The Raikage's eyes lit up in a mix between alarm and rage before rolling back as he slumped forward onto his desk. To all the world it would simply look like he had fallen asleep, and there would be nothing about his body to say otherwise. However, he would have a rather nasty headache in the morning. Naruto's body slumped forward as all the tension left him. That was a stressful situation he would rather not repeat. The man must have been seriously overworked or tired at the moment, because Naruto just couldn't believe he had just pulled off that he had. Before his ego could swell any, he quickly reminded himself of why he was here, moving to the back of the room where a row of filing cabinets lined the wall and quickly disabling the seal guarding them. Hurriedly skimming along them with alert and anxious eyes, he stopped, nodding once before pulling out the cabinet. He flicked through the many manila folders he found until finally pulling out the one marked Sage. He scanned the document as fast as he was physically able, not wanting to be in this room for any longer than he needed to be, committing most of it to memory as a frown passed over his features. He slipped it back in where he found it and silently shut the cabinet, thankful it moved without squeaking. He cast one more curious glance around the spacious office, noticing with an amused smirk that two of the windows that overlooked the village were smashed in, seemingly from the inside. He had heard rumors of the Raikage's eccentric manner of leaving rooms, but he hadn't really believed them before now. He made his way over, looking out over the peacefully dozing village with a small smirk. He just shrugged his shoulders once before launching himself from the jagged hole, suppressing his urge to cry out in exhilaration. Another stealthy walk through the village and Naruto found himself staring at the tightly locked entrance to the museum. Apparently Kumo thought they were safe in the knowledge the artifacts on display were fakes, the real ones were actually kept in an underground storage facility beneath the museum. Unfortunately for Naruto, that only meant one of the artifacts, the Kohaku no Juhei. All the others had been lost to Kumo with the defection of Ginkaku and Kinkaku, Kumo's gold and silver brothers. He didn't know much more than that, about the artifact's location or the brothers, because their files were in a different cabinet and the blonde had felt he was pressing his luck as it was. For now he would look for information on the two elsewhere and instead focus on the remaining treasure Kumo still possessed. He slipped inside the museum only to immediately pull back out again as quickly as he dared. He had nearly walked right into two patrolling shinobi, a tall blonde-haired one he recognized as she and another dark-skinned one he didn't recognize. She's partner wore the traditional Kumo flak jacket over a dark high-collared shirt that brushed the edges of his messy white hair. He had an overall bored demeanor, reminding Naruto somewhat of an older Omoi, except much deadlier if his confidant stance and large sword said anything. Naruto flattened himself against the museum wall as the two walked out, seemingly on a routine patrol. However, the blonde blanched as she suddenly stopped with a frown on his face as he looked around the area. Naruto nearly ran for it when the man's eyes drifted over him. It may have been a trick of the fading light, but the blonde could have sworn the Kumo shinobi's gaze lingered on his position for a moment. What is it? The blonde's partner tried to look at where his teammate was so intensely staring, but saw nothing but the wall of the museum they had been patrolling. The light-skinned ninja just stared a moment longer with a frown before shaking his head dismissively. It's nothing, Darui, just thought I sensed something for a moment, but it was weak, probably just a rat or something. The bored-looking man just shrugged as he turned to continue their patrol route. He hated the museum, it was too dull for him. She lingered a moment longer, casting a backwards glance at the spot he swore he had sensed something in. It was the briefest flicker of a chakra signature, no larger than a small mammal, but just the fact it vanished so quickly disconcerted him. Inside the museum, Naruto panted, releasing the pent-up breath he had been holding as she intently stared at the position he had been standing. He had taken the first opportunity to move as he could, the moment the shinobi looked away to talk with his teammate. While it was good to know his technique could stand up to an obviously powerful sensor type, he didn't want to go through something so nerve-wracking again. He had no intention of fighting his way out of Kumo and no illusions he would make it on his own power. He let out another sigh before righting himself, quickly making his way through the various levels of the museum, disabling the various security seals he came across. It would leave a sure trail of where he had been, but he had no intention of staying long enough for any Kumo nin to capitalize on it. Once again he passed through the fake artifact display, casting a slight glance at the large and false pot, replicating the object he was here to steal. He had actually fought a rather long and painful struggle with his conscience in order to go through with this. Technically the Kohaku no Juhei was a part of his legacy, however it was technically Kumo's property. Then again, they weren't really using it, it had only ever been used to seal the Hachibi away between Jinchuriki. Anyway, right now they had Kurabi and he was as stable a Jinchuriki as they came, minus the strange fixation with rapping. Even then, over 4 years of monk teaching had been hard to suppress in order to do this. However, if he wanted to understand more about his ancestor, with Kyuubi so unwilling to talk, he needed to study the man's possessions. These thoughts kept him occupied as he snuck into the maintenance area of the museum only to be faced by two standing shinobi in front of a large vault-like door. Unfortunately for them, Naruto didn't approach them with nearly the trepidation he did the Raikage, and soon they were on the floor, blissfully snoring in unconsciousness. Sometimes he just loved his shikuju. It took him surprisingly little time to break through the many complicated and numerous seals covering the surface of the storage facility's door. All seals really did share the same flaw that made them so useless against him. It would be amusing if he wasn't completely nullifying one of the most prestigious fields of the shinobi arts. After about 5 minutes all the seals were drained and succinctly useless, the door sliding open like it was covered in grease. Naruto's eyes nearly bugged out of their sockets as he gazed into the room. It was filled to the brim with shelves upon shelves of ancient artifacts. The time periods seemed to range from the Third Shinobi War stretching back way beyond the Warring Clans period. It was truly an impressive sight, but not one that would detract Naruto from his goal. It was sitting rather high up on one of the larger and sturdier shelves, in order to accommodate its weight. The Sage of the Six Paths really lugged that thing around. Seems rather impractical. His thoughts weren't all that wrong. The pot itself came up to his waist and when he lifted it he nearly threw his back out from the strain. He carefully set it back down, wiping his forehead a little and suddenly realizing he had miscalculated slightly. He wasn't sure if his technique would be able to envelop the large sealing pot completely. A giant floating purifying pot wasn't exactly discreet after all. However, before that he looked intently at the large lighting kanji inscribed on the pot, reconfirming that it had been added later. Not only that, but it contained a few seals worked into the ink. He couldn't tell what they did, but he could only assume it was for tracking the pot, especially after the other tools had been stolen. It only took him a moment to remove the seal, watching with a little satisfaction as the ink dried up and peeled off, leaving the pot unblemished, as it should be. With a grunt of exertion and a healthy amount of chakra reinforcing his muscles, the young monk managed to maneuver the pot onto his back, groaning slightly from its weight. Luckily for him though, his technique was just about able to cover both him and the pot, although he was seriously stressing his control now. He was just lucky the Kohaku no Juhei was mostly smooth, or his technique might not have been enough. That would have been awkward. After another quick trip through the museum, Naruto once again found himself outside, the cold mountainous air brisk against his skin. He jostled the large artifact on his back into a more comfortable position before setting off into the village, feeling somewhat like a snail with his pace and the large object on his back. This time he passed a few shinobi in the streets, doing his best to avoid them and mostly relying on his technique to see him through to the village's gates. However, he failed to notice one kunoichi in particular as he passed her. Her ears twitched ever so slightly and she gently sniffed the air with a curious and slightly confused expression. Naruto panted slightly in a large rocky. Clearing some distance from the village, it was about a mile away from the rendezvous he had agreed on with Fu, a small village to the south of Kumo. He straightened up, stretching out his spine with a few wonderful cracks that left him with a contented grin. He had dropped the invisibility technique by now, instead devoting the chakra to his arms, legs and back in order to support the Kohaku no Juhei better. His relaxed posture went rigid though as an almost sixth sense-like ability kicked in, allowing him to turn in time to halt 3 kunai aimed for his back as if they had struck some invisible surface. He blinked in surprise, not having detected anybody following him all this time. Nonetheless, a woman dropped down from her lofty perch in the rocks above him, her long, tied-up blonde hair fluttering in the wind as she fell. Well, that was an impressive technique, especially for a monk. Naruto immediately recognized her as the rather playful kunoichi he had met on the first day in Kumo, Yugito if he remembered her name right. The smaller blonde just grinned cheekily, placing the pot down on the ground with a small thud. It wasn't like the woman could just pick up the pot and go, it was too heavy and chakra draining. Even so, the same applied to him. He knew it would either be suppress this woman or abandon the sealing pot, not both. Trade secret, I'm afraid. Yugito smirked outwardly, however inside was a different story as her gaze drifted to the Kohaku no Juhei. She had followed her instinct on a hunch, her enhanced hearing picking up very soft footfalls from where she couldn't see anybody walking. There was also a scent she could detect, but it was almost like somebody was suppressing it like one might their chakra, which just sounded ludicrous. I guess I'll have fun working the answers out of you. She licked her lips seductively in an attempt to throw the boy off a little. Disappointedly, it seemed he wasn't affected at all. He was all business right now. Naruto just grinned, slowly gathering his chakra around him in preparation for anything the woman could throw. He just hoped there wasn't any backup waiting. You can try. Along that same line of thought, Yugito now wished she had brought backup. She always was too brash for her own good, as Darui-sensei would tell her. When the boy had finally dropped whatever invisibility technique he was using, which impressed her for once she finally saw why he was running away. At first it had amused her, simply thinking the boy would drop from his chakra being drained after a few minutes. However, he had just kept going, he didn't even look tired now, and he had been running with the pot for about an hour. Just the thought of how large his chakra reserves must be almost frightened the Junin. "Oh, I intend to, little monk." Deciding not to play around anymore, Yugito quickly flared her chakra. Almost instantly her nails grew out about a foot in length, sharp as razors. She dropped into her four-legged stance the same moment Naruto moved into his own after planting his shikuju into the ground. Mizu no Mai. Yugito cocked her head a little, noticing that the stance was eerily reminiscent of the Hyuga Taijutsu style from Konoha. However, this boy did not look like one, although she could not see his eyes. She rushed forward, lashing out with her claws in a very straightforward, but very fast lunge that was supposed to leave the boy impaled on her claws. She would like to play around with him a little, but stealing precious artifacts from Kumo was a serious offense. Naruto surprised her by moving with unbelievable grace, slipping to the right of her attack and almost gently nudging her clawed hands up and away from his body. When she rounded, she noticed Naruto raise an eyebrow at her in curiosity that quickly shifted to understanding. "You're a Jinchuriki, aren't you? For the Nibi, right?" Yugito faltered in the attack she was about to perform, looking at the young blonde incredulously. She quickly shook her head of the surprise. Her status wasn't exactly secret in Kumo, at least to the shinobi, and if this boy could find out where the Kohaku no Juhei was kept, he could quite easily gain information like that. She recovered in time to launch a quick offensive, this time being more measured in her movements. She came forward with a barrage of lethal slashes, making sure to keep her footing light and mobile so she could attack from many angles. However, the boy's body flowed like water, she couldn't even touch him. Occasionally he would use a hand to divert her away from the wrist, and each time she came away she felt oddly tired. Deciding to take a different approach, she leapt back, flashing through hand signs in the air to finish on the tiger seal. Kaiten, Gukaku no Jutsu. With that she breathed out an enormous stream of bright blue flames that took the shape of an enormous sphere. She watched as it barreled down on the young monk, making her smirk as she prepared for her next attack. However, she watched on, surprised as the boy made no effort to dodge in any way, quickly being engulfed by the technique. Yugito just shook her head in wonder. She had been sure the blonde would be able to dodge that. It wasn't the fastest technique even if it was supercharged by the Nibi. She had planned on him dodging so she could catch him in the air where he couldn't dodge. Shinra Tensai. In her shock she had let her guard down slightly. Even if she hadn't, little could have prepared her for the enormous wall of invisible force that crashed into her body. She flew limply through the air, watching as the sphere of flame dwindled down to nothing, absorbed into Naruto's outstretched palm as his other was pointed towards her. Luckily her reflexes kicked in, allowing her to twist impossibly in the air to land back down on all fours in a pose that reminded Naruto of a cat. It was fitting, he supposed. Yugito made the logical leap that any of her other fire techniques would be just as effective as the first, and given the fact Naruto only had a few singes on his clothes, she didn't think that was very. Just to be sure though, she began to run forward, keeping a trained eye on Naruto's hands in case he tried that repulsion move again. As she ran, her hands flashed through seals that, while Naruto's Rinnegan could clearly see and memorize, would be just a blur to a most. Raiden. Gion. She held out both palms in front of her and immediately a bolt of pure lightning shot out like a laser, on a direct course with Naruto's body. It was so bright that the surroundings actually seemed to dim in comparison with the vibrant white bolt. Naruto simply stood there, once again making no effort to dodge the technique. This time her vision was unobstructed, so Yugito was clearly able to see the jutsu get absorbed once it reached a certain distance from his body. Wow, now that's impressive. So are all ninjutsu just as effective on you? Naruto's only reply was a slight smirk as he raised his hand up. He didn't call out the name this time, but Yugito was ready nonetheless. However, she just happened to be ready for the wrong technique. Instead of dodging the invisible wall of force like she had planned, she suddenly found her body moving towards the blonde against her will at a shocking speed. She tried to twist her body and claws to use this sudden momentum to her advantage, but Naruto seemed to preempt this. He twisted his body out of her path at the last moment, her claws uselessly scraping air as he dropped the technique, allowing her forward momentum to carry her straight into a large boulder. However, she wasn't a Jinchuriki for nothing. Her durability outright beat most elite Junin, and she was able to quickly jump to her feet, agile eyes scanning for danger. However, Naruto was just standing there, arms crossed at the center of the clearing with perfectly even breathing. He didn't even look remotely tired. If anything, he looked slightly more refreshed than when they had started fighting. Unfortunately, Yugito couldn't say the same. Usually she would have energy to spare in fights, but those mysterious touches of his seemed to just leech away her energy. That wasn't to say she was out just yet, but with his ability to absorb ninjutsu and her inability to get close, unless he wanted her to, she found herself rather stuck. She was always appalling at genjutsu, she lacked the control for it and had never even touched on fuinjutsu, that was heavily discouraged by the Raikage for obvious but not unjustifiable reasons. Hey Gaki, you're pretty good, I'll give you that. Unfortunately, I have some stuff to do back home, so I'll be wrapping this up now. She felt slightly humiliated that she had been forced to use her trump card against a kid that probably hadn't hit his teens yet. Unfortunately, in the shinobi world, you just had to acknowledge there were opponents that were both younger and stronger than you, even if such a fact stung your pride more than just a bit. Naruto just watched on in interest, curious to see what the other blonde would do against him. Yugito suddenly dropped down on all fours, chakra radiating from her body like a beacon as blue flames began to lick her skin. The sheer pressure snapped the bandages holding her long ponytail together, allowing her hair to flare wildly about her. Naruto was slightly worried now, however, not because of the copious quantities of chakra radiating off of her. The more chakra she used, the more chakra he could absorb. No, it was because with all this Biju chakra being thrown around, Kumo was sure to have noticed. You didn't have to be a sensor to feel this, no more than you needed great eyesight to sense if the sun was out. However, Yugito managed to surprise him. Instead of using the Biju cloak like he imagined she might after hearing about it from Fu, she instead erupted into an enormous sphere of blue flames. And there, standing before him a few moments later in all its flaming glory, was the Nibi no Nekomata, staring at him with one green eye and one yellow. Naruto just stood there, observing it for a moment as it exhaled a huge fireball, much larger than the one Yugito produced. Of course, Naruto just stood there and took it as chakra. No matter where it came from or how dense it was still chakra. Then again, he wouldn't like to test that theory against anything like a Bijuadama. From what he had heard from Fu in her training with the violent attack, it was rather nasty. All he knew was that after training with it for the first time, Tani no Kuni had a few extra valleys to its name. When the Nibi realized its attack had no effect, it roared at Naruto aggressively, ready to charge forward and crush him with its tails. Naruto just stood there uncaringly. He had a lot worse from the Kyuubi, whose chakra was both more potent and more terrifying. However, before it could attack, Naruto opened his eyes fully. The enormous cat immediately stopped, staring into those rippled eyes like it was hypnotized. Naruto had been prepared to throw it back towards Kumo if he had to, but stopped himself as the flaming cloak began to recede, the enormous feline dissipating into blue flames. All that was left was a panting and weary Yugito in the center of a still smoking crater, her head lolling about tiredly. She just looked up at Naruto's calm, unscathed form as he walked towards her, a hint of fear appearing in her eyes before she succumbed to the stress of using her Biju's chakra and fell unconscious. Naruto was about to grab the Kohaku no Juhei and hightail it out of there, but looked back at Yugito's prone form. He estimated Kumo Shinobi would reach his position in just under 40 minutes. With a brief internal debate, he nodded resolutely. That was enough time. Chapter 24, Lightning Part 5. Friendship is a single soul dwelling in two bodies. Aristotle. Shizuku was worriedly pacing the small shack they were in. It was old and in terrible disrepair, but it at least had a roof and wasn't going to fall apart anytime soon. Fu was just curled up in the corner, a book on her lap as her eyes skimmed across the pages absently. In honesty, she wasn't actually reading. She hadn't turned a page in over an hour. However, she wasn't the type to pace out of worry. He's taking too long. Something must have gone wrong. Fu just looked up a moment, her deep orange eyes peering over the top of her book before flitting back down. You're worrying too much. Naruto-san is strong and you know how good the technique of his is. Shizuku nodded with a frown but didn't stop pacing. Her footsteps seemed to fall in time with the rain outside, pattering lightly on the wooden shack. But what if something went wrong? Or his control slipped? Or somebody bumped into him? Or Kumo has some really powerful sensor type. Or, she stopped when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Fu had moved across the room without her even noticing, her book conspicuously absent. Naruto-san is strong. Her eyes were steady and determined, it was a wide leap from her usually expressionless mask. Shizuku had noticed that the only times Fu seemed to gain any kind of emotion was when she was talking about Naruto or a book she was particularly interested in. The Violette nodded again sadly. No matter how confident Fu's words were, she would always worry about Naruto if she could. Well, I might not go as far as strong, but I do my best. The two girls spun so quickly Naruto feared they might have left burn marks in the floor. He was standing there, dripping wet, with the Kohaku no Juhei by his side and a sly smirk on his face. Naruto-kun. He suddenly found himself bowled over by a flying purple blur that left him in a heap in the floor with an excited and relieved Shizuku straddling his chest. Wow, what a warm welcome. He grinned slightly as Shizuku blushed and quickly dismounted him, backing away with red staining her pale face. The blonde got up, looking around the small tattered shack the girls had been staying in. The wooden planks holding it together seemed worn but not moldy, and everything was tinged with a hint of moisture. Masaru seemed to like it the most, hanging lazily from a high rafter by his tail and looking down on the new arrival with the occasional curious chitter. So this is the Kohaku no Juhei. Fu looked at the large stone pot curiously, briefly wondering how Naruto had managed to lug something this large all the way out here from Kumo. She touched it experimentally, feeling how her chakra was immediately absorbed into it like Naruto's Shikuju. It's definitely one of the sage's tools. Naruto just nodded as he patted the enormous purifying pot on the side. So how does it work? It was Shizuku who asked, staring curiously at the unassuming, but definitely old-looking sealing pot. Naruto raised a hand up with his mouth open, only to frown and look back around at it. Actually, I have no idea. Shizuku and Fu immediately sweat dropped as the blonde sheepishly rubbed the back of his neck. I guess you just open it. Fu raised an eyebrow at that as Naruto went to lift the small wooden lid covering the pot. Isn't that dangerous? Naruto just waved her off as he tentatively raised the lid just a crack. All three were holding their breath at this point as Naruto moved the lid further and further up. Finally he pulled up to reveal exactly what was supposed to be inside of a purifying pot, a dark nameless liquid. Naruto just stared at it for a moment, half expecting it to do something. When it didn't, he just shrugged and replaced the lid. Is it broken? Shizuku was curiously looking over the large stone container, careful not to touch it though. She had learned that she had larger than normal reserves for her age, but nowhere near enough to hold Naruto's staff for more than a few minutes. Again Naruto just shrugged. He probably should have learned how the pot worked before taking it. That was an error in hindsight. How are we going to carry it around? It's hardly inconspicuous. Again Naruto drew a blank, suddenly realizing how little he had thought this through. It had seemed so simple before, or at least as simple as stealing a highly prized artifact from both the Raikage's office and a secure vault in Kumo could be. It wasn't like they could share the burden, only Naruto and Fu could carry it safely, and in her case it wasn't for all that long, maybe an hour at maximum. Well damn. Naruto slumped to the floor, seriously considering the possibility of just cutting their losses, leaving the Kohaku no Juhei and just running for it. He was sure by now Yugito would have woken up, and that meant they knew who had stolen the artifact and would be scouring the area for them. In a fit of frustration Naruto smacked the pot with his staff, only to join Fu and Shizuku in watching amazedly as the pot shrunk before their very eyes. The stone seemed to contract on itself, any slight cracks that had been there before fading away as the entire artifact condensed into a small pot that might fit in somebody's palm, the thick white rope now better resembling string. Well, that's convenient. Naruto just blinked as it suddenly made a lot more sense for the sage to carry this around as opposed to its hulking counterpart. It made him wonder if the other artifacts had different forms they could turn into. It made him look at his staff appraising Ly. Fu just nodded with a skeptical eyebrow, wondering where that fit of luck came from. Suspiciously so. Naruto just shrugged with a pleasant smile, picking the now considerably smaller pot up from the floor. Right now it didn't look all that special. Kumo certainly wouldn't recognize it, which was a plus. Hey, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. He quickly fixed the pot to his belt, hanging it by the white string which was just about long enough to keep the priceless artifact secure. Strangely, even with its reduced size, the chakra it tried to draw from him was exactly the same. It would still be unsafe for most to hold, never mind use. He looked up with a grin. This made things a lot easier for them. Well, that's one problem dealt with, but we should probably get going. Kumo's going to be scouring this village in probably a few minutes. Fu's eyes widened at that. She had expected a response from Kumo with one of their most precious artifacts stolen, but not so soon. You were followed. Naruto just nodded with a sheepish grin, already heading for the door. He smiled when he noted the Kohaku no Juei didn't hinder his movement at all. However, like with his Shikuju, he was having to use the Preta path consistently so it didn't slowly drain him of chakra. It's a long story, I'll explain on the way. And with that the trio took off into the rain, making their way south as fast as they could go. Naruto was sure there would be Kumo Junin faster than them, especially with Shizuku, but without them knowing where they were going exactly they would have to spread out and search, slowing them down considerably. His only problem would be if a sensor picked up his trail, which was why he was using his Boidogakur technique on and off to confuse any would-be pursuers. They reached a small coastal town on the south shore of Kaminari no Kuni around an hour later, stopping atop a large hill overlooking the shore. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, sending a shimmering orange glow across the calm waters as far as the eye could see. They had purposefully picked the town due to its out-of-the-way, but still close location. The plan was to hire out a boat from here as quickly as possible that could take them south to Mizu no Kuni. It had been Naruto's original plan to go to Tsuchi no Kuni after Kaminari no Kuni, due to it being next on the elemental cycle. However, that would involve them passing through an area where Kumo had very high presence, either that or skirting around the area, which would give Kumo Shinobi enough time to pin them down. Naruto figured they could always go to Tsuchi no Kuni another time anyway. The original plan was more like a guideline anyway. The trio found a small abandoned cottage that looked like it had been completely ransacked a long time ago. The roof was just barely holding its own weight and the stone walls were missing more than a few of their rough-hewn bricks. Anything of value inside the tiny building had long ago been taken or stolen, only a few pieces of rotting furniture remaining. Luckily there were no leaks they had to deal with, not that they planned on staying long. Alright, you two know the plan. He handed the pouch containing their money to Fu, who simply nodded and strapped it onto her belt beneath her traveling cloak. The idea was for Shizuku and Fu to go out and find a boat that would be willing to take them over to Mizu no Kuni for as little as possible. Naruto would stay here in case he was accidentally spotted or recognized. He also had something to do while they were gone, but he felt as though he could leave that out until they had more time to talk safely. Fu and Shizuku gave their own small nods as they quickly set off from the dilapidated cottage, Shizuku giving him a quick glance over her shoulder as she went. When he was sure they were gone, Naruto returned to the driest part of the building, setting himself down in a comfortable meditative position and closing his eyes. It didn't take him long to steady his breathing. It had been an integral part of his training to learn how to use his Boidogakur technique. Soon enough he felt his consciousness slipping away into that same familiar place. For the third time in his life Naruto found himself standing in the halls of his seal, standing comfortably with his Shikuju in hand and the Kohaku no Juhei at his hip. Once again there was a new pipe running the length of the ceiling, larger than his own and Shukaku's but still completely dwarfed by the Kyuubi's. He noticed with a wince that this new pipe was leaking, even worse that Shukaku's had. He had known that before. It had felt like a weak acid had been running through his blood all the way back to the rendezvous. However, he had kept a straight face for Fu and Shizuku's sake, only now allowing his face to show the weariness and pain he was feeling. In that instant a few years seemed to fall on his shoulders, his eyes holding experience that nobody his age should ever have to endure. He quickly straightened himself out, exerting his will over his inner domain with a trembling hand as he watched the hallway fix itself, the pipes slowly closing up. Once he was satisfied everything was as it should be, he started to make his way along the corridor with its well-memorized twists and turns, no rush in his movements. He did note with a grimace though that it had taken considerably more control and time for his Preta path to fully assimilate the new chakra source. It also didn't escape his knowledge that even now some of his power was being diverted away just to keep the raging chakra within him in check. The passages of his seal had become almost second nature to him now. He had often gone wandering in the seemingly random corridors to see where they led, often hours on end. It turned out though that they really did only represent his natural chakra pathways. The only places of note were the slightly widened area he presumed represented his coils. That was why it only took him a few scant minutes to turn into the large open area he had become so familiar with, even if it had undergone yet another change. Instead of the pentagonal room he had been used to since the Ikibi had been added to the seal, an entirely new cage occupied an equally new wall, changing the room into a hexagon. That made Shukaku's cage on the left as he walked in, the Kyuubi's on the right and the new cage directly in front of him. Even as he walked in he could hear the standard argument between the great sand construct and the enormous fox, however there seemed to be a new voice added into the mix. Damn it. I don't care about either of you assholes or your petty squabbles. That was quickly followed by the telltale sound of cage bars being beaten on, in futility of course. I had a good thing going with that idiotic Rinnegan, and now I find myself locked up in this place with my two least favorite siblings. Another scream of frustration echoed through the corridors of his seal as Naruto watched the proceedings with veiled amusement. Why couldn't it have been Isobu or Kokuo? At least those two are quiet. Naruto was rather surprised to find the new voice was rather feminine, despite its loud and booming timbre that came with the size. The little kitty got locked up as well. Ah, this is just too good. That was a voice Naruto recognized all too well. Shukaku's insane laughter boomed through the area even louder than the first voice. Shut it, Shukaku. Once I break out of here I'll rip your sandy neck out, I swear it. A deep chuckling followed that which Naruto knew belonged to his resident fox, obviously enjoying anything that had to do with Shukaku in immense amounts of pain. And you, Kurr, the new voice was finally cut off by an immense and awe-inspiring roar that thundered through the seal to the point where everything was vibrating for a few moments after it stopped. Don't you dare use my name, you pathetic feline. The Kyuubi's tone was a lot deeper and menacing than usual. Even Shukaku had been somewhat shaken from his insane laughter and was now quivering slightly under the pressure exerted by the Kyuubi's will. Not while he is here. As if to emphasize his point, the great fox cast a disinterested eye over to Naruto's form, who had been content to remain silent and just take in the interaction between the three Biju. Naturally Shukaku was the first to recover. Father. Naruto had to spend the next minute rubbing the great tanuki's head until it contentedly fell asleep against the bars of its cage. All the while a set of yellow and green eyes watched him carefully from the darkness of their own cell. When Naruto finally moved back into the center of the room and descended to a meditative position, the new addition finally made themselves known as it walked out of the darkness of the cell. So I wasn't wrong, you truly bear the Rinnegan like our father. The Kyuubi snorted but said nothing, giving time for Naruto to observe the Nibi no Nekomata. There wasn't really all that much to say about it besides that it was an enormous two-tailed cat made entirely of blue and black flames. It had heterochromic eyes, one being a bright shining yellow, the other being a more subdued green. Out of all the Biju he had met so far, which to be fair was only 3, it had the most feminine appearance and voice. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, it's nice to meet you. The great flaming cat smirked, baring its sharpened canines slightly as it lowered its body to lie in a similar fashion to the Kyuubi. My, aren't you an interesting and polite Rinnegan? How fascinating. The large cat looked at Naruto for a moment, its decolored eyes seemingly piercing right through him. I am Matabi, the Nibi no Nekomata. The Kyuubi growled dangerously from its cell at both Naruto and Matabi, sneering in both disgust and anger. The little respect I had for you is crushed, cat. It spat the word angrily with narrowed eyes, almost making its fellow Biju flinch under the steely gaze. To so willingly debase yourself and hand away your name in the same careless manner that Rinnegan do. I had expected you to be better than that insane tanuki, instead you practically hand yourself away to this mere child. It growled once more before closing its eyes, ignoring the world for a now in disgust and apathy. What do you mean? What is so wrong with me learning its name? The Kyuubi barely cracked an eye, although it was still filled with rage and something else Naruto couldn't fathom. I do not expect a Rinnegan to know the value of words, especially a name. With that the Kyuubi closed its eye again, settling down on its paws away from the cell door. Naruto turned to the Nibi for an explanation only to find it smiling at him, and not in the cruel manner the Kyuubi did or in the insane way Shukaku managed. If anything, the large cat looked pleased, as well as that emotion fit on a 2-story tall flaming cat. Do not mind my brother Rinnegan, he has always been too prideful for his own good. I warned him it would someday bite him in the tails, and look where he is now." The only response was a small but still deadly growl from the fox. Naruto was more surprised to hear the Kyuubi be referred to as a he. He was under the impression Biju lacked any defining genders. He. The great cat just tilted its head curiously, or was that her head? "We may not have gender, little ninja, but we certainly gained aspects of both our father and our progenitor. Some more masculine." She shot a pointed look at the Kyuubi's cell. The fox didn't even grunt in acknowledgement. "So naturally some more feminine. Our father gave us these bodies and minds, only he knew what we really are." Naruto just nodded. It made somewhat sense. It at least made referring to them easier. "So the sage of the six paths really was your father?" The Nibi nodded languidly, its eyes half-lidded in a lazy manner that at least lived up to the species she emulated. "Or our mother, in the sense he gave us life." Another Cheshire smile split the cat's flaming face as it stared at Naruto with those same piercing eyes. "And here you are, his successor in the flesh. And over 1,000 years later, unless my sense of time has gone askew during my captivity. I guess that makes you my new master." Naruto wasn't quite sure what to make of that. He had never expected any of the Biju to be so submissive. The Kyuubi on the other hand seemed to know exactly what to say on the subject, expressing it with an angry fist slamming down onto the floor. "Enough. That mere child will never be a sliver of the man the sage was." The fox's voice only carried pure rage and disgust, its volume nearly enough to wake the peacefully sleeping Ikibi. "Our father could stride across oceans, create beings from nothingness, was strong enough to defeat the most powerful being known to the earth, and still strong enough to create us on his deathbed. You would do well to remember that, cat." He finished off with a low sneer of contempt, allowing his restless tails to stop their agitated swaying. "Please, fox, he bears our father's eyes and staff, he even looks like him. What more could you possibly want as proof that this is the true legacy our father left to the world?" Naruto was starting to become slightly uncomfortable as the center of an argument between two such powerful beings. The Kyuubi on the other hand was unfazed, growling lightly as he lay back down with his eyes fixed in a permanent glare. "You always were a pitiful sycophant." At that Matabi returned the glare to the Kyuubi, although it lacked the same sheer presence the fox could exert. "Coming from our father's personal lapdog. You heeded his every beck and call like it came from the mouth of Kami." The Kyuubi rose to its full and impressive size. It would have towered over the much smaller Hellcat if they had been occupying the same cell. "He was more powerful than any of us, he was our creator. This is just another worthless ninja who happened to catch the genetic long straw." Naruto wasn't sure whether or not to be insulted by that. He still didn't feel like getting involved though. The Nibi though simply let out a barking laugh that somehow managed to sound both feminine and powerful despite lacking the Kyuubi's sheer menace. "And it had nothing to do with the fact you were the first he created." The Kyuubi merely huffed in contempt, a slightly smug look flickering across his snarling maw. "Or the fact he would give you treats when you were a good boy." At that something seemed to snap in the large fox. His eyes grew cold and filled with fury as he once again rose to his full height. "You think you are able to speak so insolently because of these petty bars?" Despite lacking the previous volume his rants had before, the Kyuubi's quite rumbling tone lacked none of the menace. "You are nothing compared to me." He launched forward, slamming his full weight into the previously unyielding bars that represented the seal. However, to Naruto's immense fear, the great steel bars actually bulged out slightly under the strain. The addition of the Nibi had weakened the seal temporarily, at least enough for the Kyuubi to do this much. "Enough." A dead quiet descended over the large room as two sets of enormous eyes turned to stare at the young blonde who had the balls to interrupt an argument between Biju. Naruto couldn't sit back idly anymore and risk the seal being weakened further. It actually terrified him to do so, but had no choice but to intervene. That was why he was now floating at the center of the room as if he was standing on the air, shakuju in hand and eyes cold. "Stop arguing like children." The Kyuubi glared at the boy, his lips pulling back into a vicious snarl as he was about to angrily bark back. However, Naruto simply leveled his cold, unyielding gaze at the mighty Biju, using all his willpower to simply maintain eye contact with the enraged fox. The Nibi simply watched this with awe, not having seen anybody but their father stare down the most powerful of the nine like that. Eventually the Kyuubi snarled once before laying back down, closing his eyes in apparent indifference and dismissal, allowing Naruto to let out a relieved breath. Naruto calmly turned his gaze to the flaming Hellcat. This time she actually did flinch slightly, remembering a time when somebody else looked at her with that exact same gaze. It took a lot less time for the lower-tailed Biju to relent, weakly lowering her head in submission and respect. In those few moments it was like the sage himself was looking out of Naruto's eyes and she returned to the easily swayed kitten she had been at the start of her long life. "I'm sorry too-san." Naruto blinked away his surprise at the title before allowing a kindly smile to pass over his features. The enormous cat almost visibly relaxed at that. Some of the best moments in her early life had been preceded by that very same smile. It naturally calmed her. "It's all right." He gently floated back down to the floor of the room, quickly settling into a seated position as the Nibi did the same with her two tails swaying slowly behind her in perfect sync. Naruto was about to fade away from the seal when a thought struck him, or more accurately a certain pot dug into his side uncomfortably. "Matabi." The flaming cat looked up in interest. She hadn't been addressed by her actual name in a millennia, literally. Her last container, Yugito, was friendly but she only wanted her power. She had not earned the right to know her name. "Yes to-san." Another irritated grunt emerged from the Kyuubi's cell but he didn't say anything thankfully. Naruto wasn't sure he had the willpower for another staring match with the most powerful creature in existence. "You wouldn't happen to know how the Kohaku no Juhei works, do you?" Surprisingly the large flaming cat nodded, almost a little too eagerly. "Father explained all his old possessions to us." Naruto raised an eyebrow at that description. All of his old tools were ways he came up with in order to defeat the Jubi. Each one failed before he eventually tried to seal its chakra within himself. Naruto nodded slowly, the seemingly inefficient and unwieldy tools suddenly making a lot more sense now. The sword, rope, and gourd were all geared towards sealing, but in a very strange and unorthodox manner that only made sense if the sage was attempting to do something that had never been done before. The pot you have was his last attempt to seal the Jubi before he resorted to using his own body. It actually worked, but only for about a minute. Our progenitor was too powerful to ever have been sealed within an inanimate object. It works by having the target respond to a call as you send your chakra through it. Any kind of acknowledgement works. Naruto nodded in thought. It was definitely a very useful tool, easy to use and hard for enemies to escape unless they knew how it worked. "What about the Bashhausen?" The Nibi nodded slowly, remembering her father showing her the large feathered fan. That was father's attempt to recreate his ability to wield all 5 elemental chakra. He had many allies before fighting the Jubi but like Rinnegan today they were limited to 1 or 2 affinities. Unfortunately the chakra cost was too high for anybody but one of his companions to wield. Naruto perked up slightly at that, wondering who the man who stood beside the sage and was able to wield his tools was. He must have been immensely powerful. Who was he? Unfortunately the Nibi just shrugged languidly, the action looking strange on such a large creature, but then again her smile did too. "I never met him and the sage didn't talk about him. Father respected him though, a lot." Another angry grunt emerged from the Kyuubi's cell but it was ignored by both Naruto and Matabi. "Thank you Matabi, I appreciate the information." The large cat preened under the praise from the person she had now adopted as her surrogate father figure. Suddenly though she bowed her head slightly, looking oddly sheepish for such an enormous creature. "Could you?" She trailed off but Naruto saw her sideways glance at Shukaku as she lowered her head submissively. The blonde just took a deep breath, completely weirded out by everything that had gone on in the seal so far. He was sure that after today nothing would surprise him anymore. He walked forward, reaching his hand through the bars of the Nibi's cell at the same time she leaned her head forward. The blonde was surprised when the flames that made up her body seemed to quell at his proximity, better resembling blue and black fur instead. He quickly rubbed the large patch that he could reach as a low rumbling purr resonated through the room, bringing a small smile to his lips. If it had been satisfying to have the Ikibi quiver under his touch, it was doubly so for the more powerful 2 tails. He left the seal feeling oddly at peace, surprisingly glad for the new arrival. Out of all 3 Matabi was his favorite Biju so far, not that he would let Shukaku know that. Coincidentally Naruto opened his eyes at almost the same moment Fu and Shizuku walked into the cottage. By the height of the sun he would say it had been around an hour since he had gone into the meditative state. He simply looked up at the two girls with an expectant expression, only to be returned by two equally sullen ones. At least sullen in Fu's unique expressionless way, he had a knack for understanding what she was actually feeling even though she hid it. Sorry Naruto-kun, Kumo must have sent messenger birds to all the ports. Every ship is on lockdown and can't leave until it has been searched by Kumo shinobi. Most of the captains wouldn't even accept our money, they know better than to go against their shinobi village. When the blonde looked across to Fu, the mint-haired girl just nodded once, obviously having found out the same as Shizuku. He just sighed as he stood up, walking out of the cottage and into the early morning sun. Well, that's not good. He frowned in thought as he looked out over the ocean, now resplendently lit by the early morning sun. Suddenly something the Kyuubi had said echoed in his mind as a small grin alighted on his whiskered features. Don't worry, there's another way for us to get to Mizu no Kuni. For some reason Shizuku and Fu felt a little uncomfortable with Naruto's mischievous grin, they knew this wasn't going to end well for them. Naruto just turned back to the sea, the grin not leaving his face for a moment. So the sage could stride across oceans, could he? Thanks for the info, Kyuubi.